Well, thank you everybody for joining us today for this event on the state of the political parties today and more generally in principle and in American history. We welcome you to the Hoover Institution's Johnson Center, our outpost here in Washington, D.C., where we do a number of events like this, and we hope you'll join us for more, but we welcome you here today. And it's a special pleasure to thank the Foundation for the Constitutional Government for co-sponsoring today's event. The Foundation for Constitutional Government is a 501c3 charitable organization devoted to supporting the serious study of politics and political philosophy, both online and on campus, with particular attention to the constitutional character of American government and the founding of the United States. And so I encourage you to check out their website, their materials. They do a series of websites dedicated to the great thinkers, a series of websites devoted to contemporary thinkers. And so again, we thank the Foundation and our friend Andy Zwick, its executive director, for helping us plan today's event. The other series of websites or materials that the Foundation produces is Conversations with Bill Kristol. And today we have a series of conversations for you today. First on the Republican Party, then on the Democratic Party, and then on the philosophy and history of parties in general. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Bill to moderate the first panel.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, I've actually done conversations with both Jeff and Spence, so I'm familiar with this format in a way. It's a great pleasure to be asked to moderate these panels, which will take a little moderation. I think we have three good discussions. First on the Republicans, but we can also discuss Democrats here and the broader questions, and then one on the Democrats with Neera Tanden and Doug Sosnick, where we can also discuss Republicans and other things, and then Harvey Mansfield, Mo Fiorina, and Jim Caesar on bigger questions about the parties and the party system. So I don't know if you have biographies, but I can say that Spence Abraham is, in addition to having been a senator from Michigan and Secretary of Energy, and a lawyer, actually started as a very young man in politics, running races. You took a year off from law school to run a congressional race in 1974 for a good friend of his in Michigan, which lost by 312 votes or something like that. Yes, a very tough year, 74 for Republicans. And Spence was the executive director of the Michigan Party, has wide experience in party politics as well as electoral politics, as well as public policy. Same with Jeff Bell, whom I also met a long time ago, who has been worked on the Reagan campaign way back in '76, or the Nixon campaign in '68, I believe. Or is that? I'm not supposed to mention that. That's too long ago. That was good practice for the Trump years. Just kidding. And ran himself for the Senate. Fantastic upset victory I remember well, in the primary in '78 against the incumbent Republican Clifford Case, which really was a harbinger, I think, of the Reagan revolution in a way, both politically and in terms of policy. And Jeff's been very active, obviously, ever since then, in both electoral politics, political strategy, Republican Party matters. So I think we have two people who have a wealth of experience. We haven't really talked much ahead of time, though we're all friends, but whether we agree or disagree on the current moment, or maybe we just agree that we're all puzzled by the current moment. But so we'll have a discussion and then take questions. And I guess I have two topics I want to cover. One, the Republican Party and conservatism. Where does it stand? Where is it going? What's likely to happen? The obvious kind of questions that are on a lot of people's mind after the pretty extraordinary last year or two. And then stepping back from that a little bit, what about the party system as a whole? Which you've both given this a lot of thought. Jeff's written two excellent books which touch on questions of the parties, Populism and Elitism about 20 years ago, in the book on polarization. And Spence has also given this a lot of thought more broadly. So I want to get beyond I want to begin from the more practical and contemporary questions and then move to maybe talk a little bit at least about the bigger questions. So Republican Party, I guess the obvious question, on the one hand, never been better in a certain empirical way, right? Presidency, Congress, 2/3 of state legislatures, I think, 32 governorships, yet also awful lot of gloom and doom and certainly genuine splits and questions, and not winning younger voters, not winning rising demographic groups, has lost, I guess, the popular vote in, 6 of the 7 post-Cold War presidential elections. So it's a slightly odd moment of ascendancy and doubt and even worry. So how should one think about that? Jeff, you want to begin?
Well, I would agree that the situation is one of uncertainty and fragility. I should throw in that I'm completely. During the Trump era, I've dropped out of the prediction business, so I have no idea what's going to happen next, and I doubt.
Unusual honesty for a Washington think tank panel here. Dangerous honesty is what I mean.
But I think a lot of things are unresolved. The Republican Party, for all of the breadth of its support in the legislatures, governorships, both houses of Congress, having won 30 states in the last presidential election, has had a crisis of confidence in its base. There's enormous mutual suspicion between the Republican base and the party elites, and I do think it's a situation of fragility despite all the surface strength. The Democrats have completely unified their base during the Obama years, and they have absolutely no dissent. There are no primaries that have any issues involved that I'm aware of in statewide or congressional races, and yet there is a certain doubt on whether the Democrats can win general elections either at the state and local level or even at the presidential level on a conventional issue mix. So in a weird way, the Republicans' problem is just on a practical day-to-day basis for office holders and candidates is at the primary level, and the Democrats' underlying worries have to do with winning general elections, which I guess is kind of a reversal of some assumptions in the recent past. So I don't think it's at all resolved, and I think that the situation is very dicey for each party.
Say a word more just on the Republican side. I mean, what is the view? I mean, there's so many ways one could characterize that elite base split. I mean, is there one overwhelming? What do you think is the most important fault line or way of thinking about it?
I think for the base, it's not so much individual issues as a fear that the party leaders don't really want to fight the Democrats. And I don't think that the presidential primaries turned out the way they did because of an argument over issues. I think it was more that, the conventional conservative candidates, they won. What did they win? They won Ohio, Puerto Rico, and unless you count Ted Cruz, maybe one or two other primaries. And Trump won, along with Cruz, virtually everything else. So there was a kind of vote of no confidence in the people that were thought to be conventionally strong candidates. Jeb Bush, who was the best funded, strong governors like Scott Walker, just didn't make any kind of a showing. So to me, the Trump series of victories in the primaries was a vote of no confidence, a reflection of that mutual suspicion between the base and the party elites. Does that answer your request for a follow-up?
No, yes, that was Spence, yeah.
Well, I think actually that Jeff characterized it quite well. First, in terms of the party itself, I think that we're seeing, and I'm sure the other panels will reflect this as well, a decline in terms of really the role of the political party. I was the state party chairman in Michigan from 1983 to 91, and then I was, for one cycle, the head of the NRCC when, the party organizations were a very key part of almost the dominating part of electing people at anything other than the presidential level. And today I don't see that kind of role for the party. There's first of all, I think McCain-Feingold contributed a lot to that. When I was in the Senate, I was quite outspoken in terms of arguing that if you adopted the McCain-Feingold philosophy, you would weaken the parties, strengthen the interest groups. That's exactly what I think has largely transpired, and I always felt that was a mistake because the parties, frankly, were a filter between interests and the contribution of money, whereas the interest groups themselves, the super PACs now and so on, are much more directly connected to specific objectives. But that's weakened the parties. I think that they've become more than anything now sort of data collection centers. And I think they would largely agree with that. I think if you talk to people who run political organizations, and I actually did talk to one last week who plays a major role, and so their greatest contribution to campaigns is you know, the collection of voter lists and voter preferences and so on that over time, you know, has become kind of a library of sorts. But for the Republicans more specifically, I think that the problem you've got is, and Jeff alluded to this, is that there is a distrust. It's funny, with this many Republicans in elected office and majority roles in legislative chambers and so on, there seems to be two things. One, I think that the party elected officials aren't all that happy with the brand they've run on, or at least they behave that way to some extent. They run away from the brand that, or the perceptions of the brand. And secondly, I think that the base, as Jeff said, are unhappy with the failure to sort of fight hard at the you know, legislative level and so on for the agenda that the brand stood for. And these are interwoven, obviously. But I do think that if at least based on where things are today. Now, obviously, there's a lot more to learn about all these different investigations and so on. But I do think a large part of the base felt that President George W. Bush was allowed to swing when he was president, under assault over everything that he had control over and things that he didn't. And they got disaffected by that. And I think if the same thing happens with Trump, and he is you know, not sufficiently defended and so on, that will further, you know, broaden the divide, and you really do have a divide, and the divide is partly, I think, elite versus you know, grassroots or you know, the electoral base, and it's partly a divide because so many of the districts have become one-party dominated that the winners of these districts, congressional districts, and even some states in the Senate races tend to be, from an extreme point of view, which is the required position to win the primary, but not necessarily in a, you know, in a position to be close to a large percentage of the Republican voters. So I think they've got those kinds of challenges facing.
Spence, if I could cut in, when you said Bush was allowed to swing, I didn't quite follow what you were.
You mean swing of the wind? I mean,
right.
Not defended.
Yeah.
I think he was.
I see.
I believe he was. I think people were, or at least voters were in the Republican Party were not happy watching him assailed daily for everything from Katrina to, you know, obviously the war and so on, and the rest of the party, I think, to a large extent, allowed him to suffer the consequences of that without standing up for him. And I don't think you see that on the other side. I think that whether it was Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, and whether people were comfortable with it or not, they were much more vocally supportive of their president. And I think if you go through another 4 years of Republican president not being strongly defended, at least by some of its leadership, I think that will further alienate the base from the elected.
I think that's a very interesting point that I had never thought of before, which is that this problem of Republicans bailing out when the going gets tough started under George W. Bush. And I had not really focused on that, but it is a kind of theme in both of the last two Republican presidencies. And I would also say that if you think about how Bush and Trump reacted to the attacks, it might have partially, Trump's willingness to counterattack on anything and everything may be partly a sense that he won't get that kind of backup from members of Congress. Bush, his reaction, particularly in the second term, was my perception, he didn't respond when he was savaged and shamed. And that was my perception. I think it probably, as Spence suggested, it probably was the reaction of the conservative Republican base. And by the second term, I don't even think he let Cheney defend him all that much. And I don't know if it was a kind of turn the other cheek Christian mentality. I don't know what it was that motivated that. But I think Trump, one of the biggest differences stylistically is that Trump is going to the opposite extreme and defending himself on everything.
I mean, I guess one question have now 2 or 3 questions prompted by this interesting start of the discussion. I mean, one is how big a deal is Trump? That is to say, I think we would probably all agree it didn't have to happen. He could, a different configuration in the primaries, he might not have won. He was probably lucky to get Bush as his main opponent right at the beginning, and then Clinton. So it was sort of, if you didn't like the last 25 years, you had almost the embodiment of it in Bush and Clinton, and various other things happened, obviously. But once he won, and it's a big historical fact, and he's president of the United States. I mean, what strikes me is, if we were here 2 years ago, in 2015, I certainly would have said, now maybe I would have been wrong, but I think it would have been reasonable to say, Republicans are not an unhappy or particularly divided party. They've had divisions, Tea Party against the establishment, but the big story for me from about 2010 to 2015 was the classic American assimilation of the insurgents and the rebels into the establishment and some change of the establishment. So you end up with 2 of the 2016 candidates, Cruz and Rubio, being people who had challenged the establishment in their states in 2012 and 2010. And you end up with a mix, someone like Scott Walker trying to straddle the two, and it looks kind of like a normal party. You've got your real establishment, you're in between, your insurgents who were assimilated, a couple of insurgents who were really out there. And if you looked at the congressional party, it sort of seemed that way. In a funny way, when Paul Ryan became Speaker, I thought, well, that's kind of okay. The Young Turks are now, he's the Speaker. He's respected by strong ideological conservatives, but he gets along okay with moderates. I mean, I would have not felt, I guess, would not have seen maybe the kind of degree of dissatisfaction and worry and unhappiness that seems to be in the party today. So the party, having held the House, held the Senate, won the presidency, held pretty much all the governorships and state legislators, feels like it's very uncertain and sort of, it's an unhappy, there's a huge amount of unhappiness for a party that's doing so well. But maybe, is that just a Trump phenomenon? Should one be wary of generalizing from Trump, or is it a Trump phenomenon, but it's a real phenomenon, or was there something there that wasn't resolved, so to speak, from the Tea Party days?
I have to say I didn't predict it. If we had been talking 2 years ago, I wouldn't have had a view that was that different from yours. I thought the primaries that were about to open up, or at least a year before the primaries, the pre-campaign, had a fairly conventional outline. I agreed with the conventional wisdom that the Republican field was much stronger than average, and I didn't think about Trump at all. And so I would have said that things with the Tea Party having been assimilated and also to some extent closed down by the Obama administration and the IRS, or at least defanged, that we were probably heading into a fairly conventional year and situation. But I think that just underlines that this is something that had to be there before Trump. That's my guess. We didn't see it, but it was there.
Well, like many people who were asked by people perhaps outside of Washington to explain what was going on during the campaign, I gave a very conventional analysis throughout 2016 during the primaries, which was that, at least initially, that it would likely break down into multiple tracks, and that 1 or 2 people would emerge from these different so-called,
right,
lanes. There'd be perhaps a Christian conservative lane, and a party establishment lane, and then sort of a Tea Party lane, and so on and so forth. And I think what ultimately happened, which was not something I certainly saw, or most people saw, I think, was that there were 2 lanes at the end of the day. One, people who've run for office and are sort of in the eyes of the Republican electorate, business as usual. And there was one other lane, which was occupied by a single individual who was very different from that conventional business as usual lane. And so I think that's kind of, how we got here. As to the current situation is in some ways unusual.
Just on that, I mean, Carson, I guess, was in that other lane too, and it shows how strong it was that there were times in the polling when Carson and Trump together had 60%, 50-60% of the vote in
right,
a 15-person field, right? I mean,
it ended up just a 2-lane, with one of the lanes being something that emerged. Today, what you've got is unusual, I think, in terms of the fact that the agenda that to a large extent that Trump's administration has offered so far is not uniquely different than the agenda of Republican leaders in Congress, or if anything, it's probably more moderate than the base's agenda would be. And so you've got a divide here, a dissatisfaction with Trump that's not based on what one might expect normally, which would be dissatisfaction over philosophy. It's almost exclusively either stylistic in its basis, or it's, you know, people who were unhappy that he got there in the first place and aren't, you know, going to ever be happy. But it's unusually separate from the normal kind of division you see within the political party. That is, the divisions over you know, the agenda being pursued.
I think that's a big question for me. I mean, how much of this is about Trump, and he's such a, in a good and bad sense, disruptive force, and people have strong opinions, and then those opinions get stronger when you get annoyed at other people having strong opinions the other way. And how much of it is this figure, which doesn't mean it's not important, it just means that he's very important. Or how much of it is, but I mean, I would say you could make an argument, there'd be a kind of conventional argument to make, no, Trump challenged the Republican orthodoxy on a bunch of issues, and if Trump's going to run against moderate immigration reform, against free trade, against Bush, McCain, Romney, I would say Reagan foreign policy, never mention entitlement reform, yeah, guess what? The Republican, quote, establishment, and even a lot of Republican conservatives and Tea Party conservatives who have been focused on some set of those issues for 20 years, 30, 40 years, would be upset. I mean, Trump very unusually for a candidate, I think he's the first candidate to win a modern party nomination since McGovern, I would say, who ran against his party, ran against the recent tradition of his party. Yeah. Goldwater did and McGovern did, right? And that's sort of why they're interesting and important. But Trump was anti-Bush, basically, you know, anti-McCain, certainly anti any, you know, the leadership, trade. I mean, so I don't know. So is that a real ideological split, or is it kind of he was the outsider and?
Well, I'm looking now at where we are today.
Okay, yeah, he's adopted a lot of
what he's advocating and the agenda that, you know, that he's largely.
But which is correct? So which is the truer situation? I mean, maybe he's accommodated as president the agenda, but is there a deep underlying gulf? I guess I'm saying, is there a real gulf in the Republican Party between the quote globalists, you know, and the Steve Bannonites, if there were, you know, if there were such a group? I mean.
Well,
some of the real policy differences. I mean, on trade, immigration, interventionism.
Yeah, I don't think it's much of the reason that there's unhappiness with Trump, though.
Is that right?
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I sense rather a unhappiness with his style, with, you know, his condescension to some extent toward, you know, the establishment. It seems to me more. I mean, that's what I think it's based on more than anything. Because I don't see people going out and giving, you know, arrays of, you know, speeches about, you know, criticizing his philosophical, political, you know, agenda at this point. It's much more, you know, reluctance to be, and I think it goes back to the uncomfortableness that the establishment of the party has with the brand itself. And I think it's a tension that's gonna be there. I mean, Trump makes it exaggerated, perhaps, but I think it goes back to that.
I agree with Spence on that, and I'm a bit of a contrarian in saying that I don't really think all that much has changed since the election. I think you could even argue that the election never actually ended, in stylistically at least. The last Gallup poll before the election of Donald Trump had him at a 34% positive rating and 62% negative. How could somebody win the presidency with those numbers? I think it was Trump embodied something that was already there, and a lot of people who didn't like him and certainly didn't like his style voted for him because they wanted to shake up the situation, roll the dice, whatever, pick your metaphor. And I think a lot of people who you might have expected to rebel against the fact that, say, his foreign policy has been pretty interventionist or, you know, pro-alliance compared to what you might have expected, the same people who were willing to take a chance on him on November 8th are still willing to do so. That includes a lot of people who dislike him, but they still think he is the shot at a possible change. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, I very much think so. I think the conventional view of Trump loyalists out there and then just Trump haters misses a huge swath of the Republican electorate, which were reluctant Trump voters in the general. I would say they didn't love him, but binary choice, Supreme Court, all the obvious reasons, general economic policies and so forth, they voted for him. And I think a lot of those people remain in that role. I was struck. We just had a weekly standard conference with the Broadmoor, so it's not exactly typical of the mainstream base, but it's our readers who range from quite strong conservative, and I would say quite, quite. Some of whom were quite pro-Trump, and all the way to never-Trumpers. And I would say that the average, if you take away the two sort of groups on either side, was a kind of reluctant, voted for him, was more hopeful he would actually be a successful president after January 20th, and it now looks maybe like he's going to be, but maybe he still could be, who knows, and at least we got Gorsuch. And yeah, I was sort of struck that there was not much focus on particular issues. Right. I suppose one test would be, I mean, Jeff, you ran in '78 as a not as a proto-Reagan rebel against the establishment, because Reagan had already run in '76, but you ran against an incumbent liberal Republican senator in New Jersey. I mean, I suppose one test would be, are there a lot of Trumpite challengers to incumbents or establishment types in primaries in 2018 or 2020, or the opposite, conceivably even? I mean, if one were seeing a McGovern or Goldwater moment, one should see that, right? I think that's what those moments, or Reagan moment.
Well, but I mean, it seems to me that what Jeff represented was the beginning of the tide before Reagan's election.
Yeah.
And I think the movement starts that way. And so I think I think you could argue that the Republican momentum that began with the Tea Party's emergence in the 2010 and 14 races, was a reflection of the kind of experience that Jeff represents, which is maybe just a cycle or two, before the actual success of a new, coalition. And I don't think it comes so much afterward. I mean, I think a lot of people who run later are just, sort of phony in a sense, trying to emulate, people who were really.
But if Trump comes and goes and the Republican Party in Congress looks the same as the Republican Party in Congress looked in 2015, I mean, that's fine with me, but it would be hard, it would be very different than the effects, I think, of McGovern or Reagan. I mean, McGovern lost, but didn't win, and Reagan lost in '76, but nonetheless, a ton of people ran for Congress as McGovernites, Gary Hart in the Senate in '74 and so forth, after McGovern lost, and gradually by 80 or 82, that was the party. And I'd say somewhat differently, the young Dan Quayle, who we both worked for, ran as a Reaganite in 1980, because that was kind of the coming wave. I mean, and that could happen. I guess there'll be a ton of Republican Senate well, there are a lot of Democratic senators who are vulnerable in 2018. That's the conventional view. I mean, it's not a conventional view, it's the true view, because they control whatever 25 seats. The Republicans have 8, is that right, or that are up? Mm-hmm. And about 10 or 12 of those 25 are allegedly vulnerable. They're in states that Trump won. I mean, who will the Republican Party nominate? Will it nominate the same kind of people that would have nominated 4 years ago? Or you're saying the fight was already happening, it's going to continue to happen? I mean, that would be kind of interesting to know.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think the primary in Virginia
that was interesting.
Last week might be a tip-off
that
there's a base of support that's out there that is looking for candidates at the state level that are more in the Trump kind of mold, because I don't think people expected that race to be as close as it was.
That's so, just people. So Stewart
agree with that.
Came within a point of Gillespie, who had come within a point of Warner in the 2014 Senate race, and is pretty concerned. I mean, Ed Gillespie is not Cliff Case. Ed Gillespie worked for Dick Armey and is a strongly pro-life and quite conservative across the board, really Republican, but establishment insofar as he was RNC chairman and worked for Bush. No, that was a pretty stunning result. Now let's just talk about the other side of that result that struck me, living in Northern Virginia, is Virginia is not a party registration state, so you request your ballot, which means it, I think, oscillates more in terms of turnout. But and the Democratic turnout was 150% that of the Republican. Even though now that's partly because people thought the Democratic race was going to be closer, presumably, than the Republican race, though it wasn't. Still, that's a pretty huge gap and a pretty unusual gap. Or do you think it doesn't?
No, I don't think. I think there were millions spent in the Democratic primary between Perriello and Northam, and that tends to drive turnout. I mean, obviously, I think on the
so
Republican.
It doesn't mean the Republicans are doomed in November or whatever.
No, I think it doesn't. But you know, in the people, it's very hard, I think, to,
that, yeah.
you know, to extrapolate from these kinds of primary turnouts. But I think it just depends on whether both sides had really contentious primaries. And the Republicans didn't seem to be having one, although it turned out to be really close. But part of that is because the hardcore base turned out, and it turned out for a candidate that was running more as a Trump candidate. Although it was, in fact, a candidate who was an incumbent running against somebody who hadn't held office. So
I thought it was interesting that Ed Gillespie, at least to the naked eye, didn't seem to attack Corey Stewart that much. He didn't try to contain him. Apparently, Ed didn't see a need to contain Corey Stewart. And it kind of underlines the idea that I led off with, which is that Republicans have very dicey primaries, but maybe a stronger position in the general election, because the Democrats had such unanimity over in their gubernatorial primary that you had a guy who admits he voted for George W. Bush twice, now having a complete progressive agenda, and now he has to take that into the general election, admittedly in a state that's gotten more liberal in recent cycles. But I would think, I agree with Spence, that Ed Gillespie, even though he probably took a deep breath after that primary, has a pretty good chance against a candidate who's positioned in that left wing a manner.
Well, that'll be interesting, actually. I've been more pessimistic and more worried about the effect, obviously, of Trump on the party as a whole. I mean, Ed Gillespie saved himself, by, I guess, in retrospect, by going up with an ad in the last 48 hours that he, too, was in favor of keeping the Confederate monuments.
Oh, did he? I didn't know that.
That was Stewart's main issue. This sort of makes, I think, your point slightly contrary to my instinct to be too, issue focused. He didn't actually talk that much about immigration, though Ed had supported, I think, the Gang of Eight bill, and of course was in the Bush administration, which had supported liberal, let's say, moderate immigration reform. He didn't support it, didn't talk about, I don't think, about trade. I mean, not that a governor would have much to do with that. But it was all Confederate monuments. I mean, that was his big base rallying.
I wouldn't have predicted that either, just to be clear.
Yeah, no, it's amazing.
that would be a winner in today's Virginia.
You guys are more relaxed about the future of the party than I am, and you're probably right. What do you think going ahead? I mean, if you had to sort of 2018, 2020, I mean, any just analytically, I mean, leaving aside what one would like, but what would you say? Or just so hard to predict? Depends on how
the variable to me about 2018 and perhaps 2020 is will the Democrats make the issue about the main issue be about expelling Trump from office? If they do, then that's a very different election from just the typical midterm election bounce back of the party that just lost the presidency. If you look at the polls in the generic ballot for the House and things like that, it looks like a typical fairly strong Democratic bounce back where they get close to House control. But I don't think it has become clear whether the election is going to take on the contours of an impeachment election. If it does, I think that's not all bad for Trump, and everything is kind of up for grabs and will be decided by events, by what happens in the campaign. I just don't know the answer to whether the Democrats are going to succeed in making it a referendum on Trump's fitness for office.
I mean, a lot depends, I suppose, on the timing of the Mueller investigation. I was thinking about this over the weekend. We're doing all these panel discussions, so we're talking about all these things. And Ken Starr was there, and so I did a conversation with him. And, I mean, it does make a big difference, it seems to me, whether if Mueller resolves it by the summer of 2018, which I think is quite possible, and either says, look, so-and-so did this wrong, and so-and-so, in fact, we're bringing before a grand jury maybe for not declaring so-and-so, but basically there's no charges with respect to President Trump, there's no recommendation, no referral, I think it's called, to the Congress, and how do the Democrats then run on impeachment if Mueller, whom they've now praised and said is a respectable pick, and Trump's attacked him, says that? Conversely, if he does say there's grounds here for Congress to at least consider acting, I mean, then how do you not have an impeachment election? That would be pretty, I mean, then I guess that question is what Republicans say at that point. But so there is a big exogenous variable now, right, which helps to govern. It's not just a Democratic Party choice, I think, about shaping 2018.
No, I think that's right. I think Jeff summed it up exactly right in terms of the two possibilities here. And since the one possibility is kind of in the control of one investigation, maybe one man, it's hard to judge. I think the more interesting question is whether or not what came out of 2020 in both, or 2016 in both parties, has an impact in terms of presidential elections,
talk about that, yeah.
and the potential and the long-term survivability of the parties the way they are. Because I do think it could be the case that there is a dramatic change coming.
And what do you mean by what came out of 2016?
Well, the fact that somebody who was not a traditional candidate could win one nomination, and somebody who would run as a socialist could almost win the other nomination and get more than 40% of the vote. Really, to me, indicates that there's huge there's 4 political parties in the country, right? I mean, there's sort of 2 Democratic parties and 2 Republican parties, and the question is whether or not, as traditionally is the case, these parties kind of come back together into a 2-party climax, or if you end up with a splintering of one or both parties. I think there's a much greater possibility now going forward that you will see independent candidacies. I think that Trump has demonstrated the viability of somebody who runs from outside the political system being a formidable candidate. And I think there are people who would prefer to run outside the political party system, and you may well see one or more such people in 2020. That would obviously cause a great rupture in terms of the normal presidential outcome, but as we saw in France, it's not completely impossible for that to take place. I'd say that's the most likely development going forward, whether it's in 2020 or beyond. And I think there's at least a reasonable possibility that you could have sort of a breakdown in both parties between establishment wing and insurgent, if you want to call it that, wing, where there is some sort of combination of establishment voters from both parties available to a new third party. I think that's a more remote possibility than an independent candidacy, but a lot less remote today than it's ever been before. And I think in a world where political communications have become so more affordable, if you would, and where voters are much more, I think, bombarded with and therefore formulating kind of their own independent kind of thoughts about it, rather than relying strictly on their historic party preferences, that's a possibility as well.
Yeah, I want to say, Jeff, what do you think? I mean,
I agree with Spence. I think that the Republicans' hold on the political offices is fragile, and I think that with the tension that exists between the base and the elected officials, you can have a draining of authority from the elected officials. On the other hand, I don't think this is France. In France, anybody can enter the presidential race and become an independent, and Macron, he kind of invented his own brand, even though he had been an official in the socialist government, which was the most unpopular presidency in French history, yet he reinvented himself and was able to just run as a complete independent. Now he's invented his own political party. It's harder to do that here, where there's a lot more inertia in the existence of the system and the need to run through the system in order to gain political office.
Which Trump saw by running as a Republican instead of as a Perot-like independence. In that respect, it does remind one how the 2 parties have been the vehicles here for so long. But
but I don't think it's. I just think there's a greater possibility now, because I think the ability of very wealthy individuals to effectively create and with the the success so many very sort of modern companies have had with branding, I think it's not as impossible now to create an option to the 2 brands that people are.
No, I agree with you, and just to underline your point.
Whether it'll happen, I'm not saying it's a lock. I'm just saying there are people with.
Well, if you think back to when Trump before it was clear that Trump was going to sweep the primaries, a lot of conservatives and Republicans, their biggest fear was that Trump was just going to go independent. That early debate where he said he wouldn't commit to supporting the nominee, people had the sense very sophisticated people had the sense that this was very possible, that he could, if he was denied the nomination, he could go out, get himself on the ballot in virtually every state, and have a good chance. So I really agree with your point. I think it's harder to be Macron, but a lot easier than it's ever been in recent cycles.
And I suppose within the parties, we've now had a winner from each party. President Obama, who was unknown 4 years before becoming president of the United States, and Trump, who was extremely well known, but not known as a conventional politician, to say the least, a year before becoming president of the United States. I mean, never having run. I mean, it is pretty. So, or another way of putting it is, neither of them had run statewide. Well, Trump had never run, obviously, and Obama had run. Was a state senator who had run and lost 2-1 in a primary for Congress in 2000. So his first statewide run is in 2004. So the last 12 years of American history have been governed by people with none of the normal, very little of the normal senator, governor, vice president standing. I mean, I guess there are two separate points that you're we're all making here. One is money plus new media plus weakness of party structures and establishments and organizations plus probably 10 other cultural and sociological things make it easier to be an outsider, a self-funder, new face. You know, that could happen just in primaries for governor, senator, as well as president, right? I mean, presumably every billionaire in the country looked at Trump and thought, "Geez, he can do that." I mean, really, why wouldn't you do it? I mean, and I really am amazed that more aren't even popping up already to run for governors of big states, especially if you won in 2018. If Tom Steyer, and I have no idea if he's doing this, the big environmental donor, runs and wins the California governorship in 2018, why isn't he automatically a possible presidential nominee in 2020? It's not like you have to wait these days for 12 years. So I'm sort of surprised. Right. So there's both the weakness of stopping outsiders within the party system, and then there's a slightly separate, the related question of the Macron possibility in which both parties, you know, get taken down or seriously challenged. I guess Macron would depend. I'm sort of intrigued by that one, but Trump would have to fail somewhat. I mean, he wouldn't have to fail like he wouldn't be renominated, but he would have to be a lot of disillusioned Republicans and some reluctant Trump voters who, you know, and it could just be normal failure, Jimmy Carter failure, not Nixon or Johnson failure, right? Just sort of didn't have a big legislative successes, country's not in great shape, economy, etc. If there's a semi-failed Trump presidency that's not failed enough for him not to be the nominee, and a Sanders-Warren Democratic ticket, that is, why doesn't a Macron independent type candidate have a real shot at, you know, getting a third of the vote? I mean, that would be the question, I suppose, right? I think that is the scenario that would be the most doable. God knows these things are hard to predict, but
yeah, I mean, it would probably sort of take that type of setting, but I don't know. I see people who are extremely wealthy and who have seen now 2 presidents in a row who emerged from, you know, someplace other than the U.S. Senate or, you know, long-term Senate or long-term gubernatorial or traditional pathways. Very untraditional in both cases. Why won't they say, I'm going to start, I'm going to, you know, 2 years out, and I'm going to create this movement, and this movement's going to try to appeal to people, right-thinking people in both parties, and so on and so forth, and I'm going to get somebody who's a little bit more to the right or the left of me, depending on where I am, to be part of that. And I don't know, I think it's not at all inconceivable, and it's also, I suppose, possible that Trump himself becomes the outsider.
I think a guy like Mark Cuban sits back. He's well known as a television celebrity like Trump was before, and he looks at Trump's tweets and he says, I wouldn't have tweeted that. I think I'm smarter than Trump.
Right. I mean,
it's very tempting.
Do you know anyone who doesn't think that?
Yeah. His kids, maybe. I mean, let me ask you this question. How much should one be, are you struck, maybe I'm too struck by this, 45% of the Republicans voted for Trump, 45% of the Democrats basically voted for Sanders, which is pretty astonishing. I don't know that we've ever had as much of a rebellion against the establishment in both parties simultaneously. They usually, one party rebels or the other, you know, the Gold Order or McGovern kind of thing, but in different years. What does that show? I mean, does it show huge dissatisfaction with political elites in both parties and therefore a roiling populace that who knows where it goes? Was it kind of a fluky one-off of Hillary Clinton was such a, you know, people wanted to, young people especially, wanted to sort of say, why is this being imposed on us? And on the Republican side, Trump was so unusual that maybe one shouldn't. I mean, what are you struck by? What strikes you on that?
Well, I said about Trump already, that the race, I think, ultimately was kind of everybody who looked like the conventional presidential candidate on one side, and then, you added Carson, and I think correctly, to the mix of people who very much didn't look like conventional candidates, and that's what the Republican race became. And I think in the wake of the Obama presidency, the Tea Party movement, and frankly, a bland field of relatively unknown people, Trump was able to, for Republicans, if you look historically at who gets nominated, it's traditionally been somebody who ran before, and this time there wasn't such obviously Huckabee and Santorum, I suppose, but they were not people who had been perceived to have been, their turn. Trump, in some ways, was the best known from the beginning of the Republican field, other than Jeb Bush. Maybe they were about the same. But he did have those advantages. On the Democratic side, I think there really is, as I said, I think there's effectively four, political parties. And you saw it in the Virginia gubernatorial primary last week. You saw in both parties, fairly close contests between an establishment sort of candidacy and an insurgent candidacy. And I think the question is whether or not you're going to, I think you'll see more of that. And I think that's really what you saw with Sanders. He was the insurgent, and I think there is a, wing of the Democratic Party that's gaining, momentum. And it's, there's another panel that can speak better about that than I can, though. So,
what about conservatism? You've both been involved in the American conservative movement as well as the Republican Party, which are overlapping but different things for 40 years each. You started the Conservative Constitutionalist Law Journal at Harvard just 40 years ago. Was it next year,
yep,
I think? And
40 years, yeah.
was with the American Conservative Union and with Reagan, 40 years ago also. So, I mean, someone like me who worries that Trump is kind of the end of a conservatism that I rather liked and I think did rather good things for the country and for the world on the whole. Am I wrong? Am I too worried about that? Is this, we're not, the American conservatism is not degenerating into sort of, reactionary populism, which doesn't believe in American world leadership and free trade and limited government and all those things? Are you guys going to reassure me that I should be less worried?
No. The conservative movement has not been able to keep its finger on the pulse of the electorate very well in the last few years, and they know that. And I think that right now it's more about the progressive movement, and I do think progressive is a better term for the left than liberalism. So that's the one thing I agree with them on. But I think that they have set up a juggernaut. They have a sense of inevitability. Even when they lose elections, there's just this sense of inevitability that the sexual revolution is going to win, and local government doesn't have a great future. The administrative state is here to stay. They have a sense of inevitability that seems to transcend election results, and that I don't think conservatives have quite internalized that and have not figured out how to deal with it. That's one thing where I think the conservative base is ahead of our traditional conservative movement, as you and I have experienced it.
Well, I think you perpetually are too worried about these things, but that's my observation over the years. But I think the Republican and conservative camp had faced coming into this election a real challenge, and it's the challenge that resulted in frequent defeats since the end of the Cold War, which was how do you re-piece together a majority coalition. And I don't think people expected to, Trump didn't win a majority of the votes, but he won a majority of the electoral votes, and he was able to redefine a political majority, electoral majority, with a different set of issues. And the problem is that set of issues that has brought Reagan Democrats back over working class voters back into the Republican camp does not embrace the kind of traditional conservative movement issues that all three of us got involved with when we were early in our political careers. I think time will tell whether that coalition stays together with those issues, whether it's trade issues or immigration issues or whatever, or whether it can be kept together with a different array of issues. But I do think Trump did something which was difficult, which was to reverse the movement of working class voters back to the Democratic Party in the post-Cold War Reagan era. And by bringing a fairly substantial number of those voters back to the Republican Party, he was able to win the election. And now the question is whether or not that's a set of issues that can keep the party together on. And I'm not sure if it can, and that's I think what the next year or two will be about.
Spence, I'd like to ask you something specifically about the Midwest. I mean, you were the last federal candidate before Trump who carried Michigan. And that's a rather striking fact, because I think you won in 1994.
Right.
And what was it about the Midwest that was much riper for Republican gains than anybody thought?
Well, I do think if you looked at the Michigan electoral map this year, and looked at how Trump put together a slight 10, 15,000 vote margin in Michigan, and compared that to how John Engler as governor, or in my case in 1994 as a Senate candidate, how we won, it was very different. We won with extremely large majorities in West Michigan and Kent County, Grand Rapids. Historically, if you were a Republican Party chairman like me, you'd put together a coalition that had Republican candidate has to get 59, 60% of the vote in Grand Rapids, Kent County. Trump got 47.
Is that right?
Yeah, and based on the numbers he came out of Kent County with on election night, I initially thought Michigan would not go for Trump. But then I started looking at a whole array of the traditionally working class dominated counties, cities, these old industrial cities of Battle Creek, of Port Huron, of Monroe, of Saginaw, that in presidential years went Democrat. And Trump was winning 65% of the vote in these counties. And so he was more than making up for the attrition in some of these traditional Republican enclaves. So it was a different configuration. And I think the challenge Party Washington Republicans have is that may be the way you win these states, but it may not be, from a philosophical point of view, as appealing to what we'll call the Reagan movement conservative views of conservatism. And that's the challenge I think the party.
Well, do you think it was all economic that enabled him to overperform, or was there some cultural elements too?
I'm sure there were some cultural elements, but I really think these are communities, that are reflective of this, white working class frustration, disappointment, hopeless sense about their own and their children's futures. And I think those communities, like my hometown of Lansing, Michigan, if you're from Lansing, Michigan, and you don't have a job in state government or teach at Michigan State, it's been a very tough 20 years. And I have family members who are, not in either of those, groups. And so I know firsthand what that experience has been like in terms of trying to run small businesses or work for General Motors as Oldsmobile was phased out and things of this sort. And I think that's, a big part of it is an economic frustration and a lack of hopefulness about the direction of the country, and a real strong feeling that people in Washington not only don't get it, but sort of don't take it seriously. And I think, I had a very compelling text message from a friend of mine back in Lansing in the middle of the Republican primaries. And it said simply this, the problem you guys don't get in Washington about Trump is that these kinds of problems that we face have been going on for a long time, and the Republican leadership in Washington acts like they don't even know about it or care about it. They're just sort of dismissive of it. And the fact that they are is why Trump is doing very well here.
Now he's president, and not. I'll take one more question. I think. There you go. And now he's president, not an insurgent candidate. So, what about his presidency? What about his governing success is most important, do you think, to making this coalition that eked out an electoral college victory become a possible majority coalition? Obviously, 5% growth is better than 2% growth. I mean, obviously in general. But I mean, is there particular issues you would focus on, or particular metrics, so to speak, of his presidency that would be particularly important?
Well, I mean, I think there's two elements to it. I think part of it is stylistic. And I think the very stylistic actions he takes that people in Washington, Republican circles, get frustrated by actually has a different, more positive, favorable impact on the people that made up that Michigan majority. A sense that he isn't going to take incoming shots without responding, and that he's going to be defending himself, and that he is going to challenge, a political elite that has, in both parties, been very condescending to the voters that got fed up. And I think that's something to really, for people to focus on. I mean, I do think that a lot of voters, both parties, have felt a sense of condescension from the leadership of the parties and from Washington. And Trump, if anything, has demonstrated that he's willing to. I mean, his condescension is towards those very, elites who have tried to sort of prescript the way that American politics works. I'm not saying I agree with it or disagree. I'm just saying I think that the stylistic actions he takes that people in Washington say, "Oh, that's horrible, that's terrible, that's offensive to me, or that's offensive to," is not necessarily greeted the same way. In terms of the very substantive part of the accomplishments or issues, I just think some movement at all will be seen by these people as a demonstration that he's, he cares a little bit about what's happening to them, and it may take the form of more symbolic gestures than anything, and it, I mean, for all of its legal contortions and problems, moving forward with the travel ban, and my views on immigration are directly contrary on these issues, but still, it's the sort of thing that I think resonates with the voters who made up that majority.
I agree.
He doesn't need a Reagan-type economic boom. He doesn't need tens of thousands of jobs to come back to Lansing and Scranton. I mean, that would be the question, I suppose.
Well, the more the merrier. But part of it is just a stylistic thing.
Jeff,
6 months ago, I would have said that Trump's success or failure will depend almost exclusively on whether he delivers on the economy. That's what made him different. That's how he dominated the primaries. That's how he won much of the Midwest. But I've since come to revise that view. I think that if it comes back to, and I agree with Spence's point about the combativeness being a net plus with popular opinion, not the minus that many people see it as in D.C. If it comes down to an issue of legitimacy, of whether the election of 2016 was legitimate or whether some kind of interference prejudiced it, and whether somebody who won in 2016 doesn't really deserve to serve, I think it could turn on that rather than on the economy. I mean, I'm a little surprised to find myself thinking this, but the Democrats are so determined to make it an issue of the regime, a legitimacy issue, that Trump could underperform on the economy and still have a shot if he can win that argument.
I appreciate the point you made earlier about how political parties seem to be waning in their financial strength. Do you foresee any change in that?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think it's going to. I'm not sure that there will be. I mean, I think that the way the process works, it's gotten a little better in the wake of some of the decisions of the court, and that have kind of expanded the amount of activity that the donors can do within the parties. But as you know, we've seen people just sort of creating their own, through super PACs, in effect their own sort of quasi parties. And now that the taste of that is very attractive to somebody who's willing to write a really big check, because now instead of waiting to get a email from the RNC or the DNC about who the best candidates are, they get to parade the candidates through their own boardroom and then write the checks themselves. And I think that's going to be harder to reverse.
I would agree with that, and but I don't think the main crisis of the political parties is financial. I think it's a disconnect between the people who run the parties and the electorate.
I think I'll add one word and come here. The degree to which the parties are weak compared to donors, compared to when I was, you guys were involved in electoral politics before me, and I've never really been directly involved, but when I was Vice President Quayle's Chief of Staff and did a fair amount of political stuff, I mean, the donors now are so powerful and think they're so powerful, and now one of them has run and won the presidency, so God knows what they all think, they could and should be doing. I agree about Mark Cuban, but he's one of 50, right? I mean, or 500. Compared to our days, I mean, when I was there, it's really startling. I mean, it's not, I mean, it sound like a democratic socialist, but there's something a little weird about it, actually. I think they're too powerful, the donor class. And in a way, isn't part of this elite, the populist reaction, when they say elites, it is partly against the donor class. I mean, the fact that Trump was, or pretended to be a self-funder, but in any way clearly wasn't sucking up to donors the way every other politician. And I do think they get a little tired, voters, of seeing every time you see an elected official, he's meeting with donors at the Greenbrier or at the, Ritz-Carlton in Naples or something like that. Yeah. Mike here, I'm sorry.
What is often called Trump's narcissism, I think, is a reaction to Bush's unwillingness to actively defend himself. And so I think the way the narcissism comes across is really as a desire to defend people. But my question is, given what you were saying toward the end of your formal remarks about Trump, what Republican might plausibly have beaten Clinton?
I think Cruz had a chance, but I don't think any of them really got the formula or came close to it. I just don't think they fully analyzed or internalized what it was that Trump was doing. Just for the record, if there's a controversy over whether Trump should close his Twitter account, I would say no.
It's a contrarian. That's good.
I think this. I mean, there was during the campaign, I think there was a lot of sentiment out there that said that the only Republican Clinton could have beaten was Trump, and vice versa. That the only Democrat Trump could have beaten was Clinton. I'm not sure if that's true, but what I do think is that I don't think the other Republicans would have won if they had not run the right kind of campaign. And I think that there would have been a high degree of possibility, high likelihood that they would have not run the right campaign to beat Clinton and been willing to kind of take her on in the way that Trump did, in a very confrontational way on some of the issues where, she sought to maximize the gender issues and things of this sort. If a Republican had just run the normal Republican campaign, I'm not sure they would have done better than him, not because they weren't able to appeal to. I mean, I think they would have all had a larger group of voters they would have appealed to, but I'm not sure they would have won them and would have very likely ended up in a kind of close race, maybe closer than Romney, but not necessarily successful.
Do you think that President Trump represents the reinvention of the Republican Party, or is it basically the birth of a new party? Which, of course, we haven't fully seen yet.
Or third possibility, is it just a one-off, and he's president for 8 years, and he either is or isn't particularly successful, and the next Republican ticket in 2020 or 2024 is, a normal, so to speak, Walker Rubio or Pence, I don't know, Tom Cotton or something, it's just kind of a ticket that one would have expected pre-Trump. And that's, I think, an important question. How big a deal is Trump for the party, for conservatism, for the country?
I don't think you could return to the pre-Trump status quo. I think that somebody who's more conventional, who's a Republican that could win the presidency, would have to learn a lot from Trump.
So you think it's a big moment? I mean,
yeah, things aren't going to be the same, even if Trump is unsuccessful.
And you think that's mostly style's the right word, a matter of attitude more than policy?
Yeah, I kind of think. Yeah, I think so.
That's the right way to put it.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I do think that at least in terms of confrontational, a more confrontational Republican Party is likely to emerge here. I don't think, or at least I think, that's the direction. It'll be interesting to see. I mean, I think that right now you've got a lot of Republicans who are averse to confrontation. They're willing to let the investigations go on. They're not willing to push just as hard for investigations of intelligence source leaks as would, I think, be normal. It would probably be happening if the situation was reversed. But I think it's a little early to answer that. And I think there's some other ways it could spin based on Trump's performance, but also on, where the country is as we go forward. I mean, obviously, we've all seen, that a successful economy and things of this sort can cause, a seemingly vulnerable political figure to suddenly emerge as a very strong one in a second campaign, which, Reagan fits the bill. I mean, at this point in the Reagan presidency, maybe a little later, certainly at the midpoint of his first term, people thought he was a one-term president. Same thing for Clinton.
How much what about, you barely mentioned Congress. I think we've literally not mentioned major issues the Republican Congress is considering. How much does that matter even? I mean, would you say, the conventional view is they've got to pass, Obamacare repeal and replace and pass tax reforms. Otherwise, how can they go back to the voters and not have done that? I've always been a little suspicious of that, just as a kind of contrarian matter, that maybe that's a little too simple. But how much does it matter that this Congress, which is the first Republican president, Republican Congress, obviously, in a decade, quote, succeeds? Or what does it even mean to succeed, I guess? Or are we in a different world here where the more conventional, you pass your big legislation, you get it signed by August, and then it kicks in eventually, maybe by the midterm, hopefully, in the Reagan case, by 83, 84, and then you go to your voters and you say, see, that was worth it. I mean, which is pretty much the model of the re-elects, I would say, of most of the presidents the last three who've been re-elected. In Clinton's case, it was kicked in 95, 96, but it helped him to have the, quote, successes with the Republican Congress. But are we past that, or is it a different era, or do Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell matter? Or?
Yes. I think they do need to move forward. I mean, I think remember, they've run, 3 campaigns, 4 campaigns really. I mean, on on the agenda that they need to now enact, and hopefully most of them actually care enough about, and I believe they do, about enacting that agenda. I mean, they've run on it in 10 and 12 and 14 and 16. I mean, it's not it's pretty hard to then act like it was satisfactory to just gain a majority. I think the Republican House particularly faces the challenge of having a small number of people who actually served in a world in which there was a Republican president, House, and Senate. And I think there's an adjustment period that's involved in that, with either party, of learning that what it's like to act in not only the majority, but in the majority where your actions can result in the passage of legislation and it's being signed into law. And I think that takes some time. I mean, I went in 1995. The Republicans hadn't been in the majority in the House for 40 years, and the Senate had been 8, I guess. But people were very uncomfortable in that early stage trying to get adjusted to being in the majority where they actually had the responsibility to move things forward. And I think that there'll be some time involved here, but I'm not distressed by it. I think they'll get it done. And I think it's they may not do well in either case because it's the off year, and when you control both chambers in the presidency, you tend to lose seats, but you're much better off running on accomplishment than you are on failing to do any of the things you said.
Yeah, I agree with Spence on that. I think they need to do better, and above all, they cannot afford to be seen as ignoring or opposing everything Trump is trying to do, or else it'll hurt both Trump and the Republicans in Congress if that is the picture at the end of the 2018 cycle.
So they are wet at the hip for 2018 at least?
Yes,
whether they want
I
to
think
or
so.
not.
I think so.
If you look at the divisions between the Republican Party, are they, and the elites versus the Trump side of the party, are they more based on issues, trade, immigration, or strategy and style?
I vote for the latter.
Me too. Yeah, I mean, I really don't think they're that far apart, and I don't think Trump's conviction level with regard to some of his campaign positions, you know, is so great that he wouldn't accommodate. But I do think the problem is, like, that's what I said at the outset. I just think that we have a lot of elected Republicans who are sort of either secretly or not so secretly uncomfortable with the brand of the Republican Party. And I'm not saying they're wrong to be, but it poses a very significant problem for them because, it results in this kind of fine tightrope walking to try to maintain sort of the appearance of sensitivity or the appearance of caring or whatever, on these issues where they're being accused by people that will never vote for them or say a good thing about them of not caring and not being sensitive. But I think trying to do that's really, the problem. And I think that's where the gap is. I agree with Jeff.
I mean, I'll defer both of them to close this off. I don't know. It seems to me something like trade. The Republicans were comfortable with the Republican brand. They were for trade, and they cast courageous votes actually for trade. They supported Obama's trade deal when the Democrats wouldn't do it. I think 41, something like that, Republican senators cast the vote. I guess it was not for the TPP, but it was for the fast track authority to get to TPP. And that's because they thought it was the right thing for the country and for the world, obviously. Now they're sort of betwixt and between. They still believe that. Trump's killed the TPP. There are actual real-world consequences, maybe or maybe not, in terms of the economy and in terms of geopolitics in Asia. And B, it seems to me the Democrats do have, you both stressed, and maybe I'll make this a final question, the coherence of the Democrats, which is partly attitudinal, but it's also partly ideological, because now they have a clear message to the country, it seems to me. Whereas what is the Republican message? It's we're basically the free trade party. I don't think Republicans really are going to become the protectionist party. On the other hand, they're not going ahead with this particular agreement that had bipartisan support. And I don't know, what are they going to do? What's Wilbur Ross going to do at Commerce? He's going to complain about particular, imports a little bit. And so I think there's a real problem of governing vision if the old Republican vision isn't adequate. And if people like me are happy that Trump's backed off from what seemed to be his alternate vision, but now we're just kind of in nowheres. What is the foreign policy vision? Well, we're not going to do anything really tough like what Bush did in Iraq. We're not going to be America first, really, though we're going to use that slogan. So we're just going to be kind of, won't mention Article 5 here, but I'll mention it here. And we will bomb Syria once, but we're very wary on the ground troops. And Mattis will make the decision on Afghanistan, because I don't want to be the guy sending troops somewhere, but I'm not going to actually overrule Mattis and McMaster. Isn't that kind of a problem, or is that unfair? We're just 6 months in, and he's feeling his way and all that.
I think the foreign policy so far is probably Trump's strongest point in comparison to the Obama administration. I think people are relieved that you have a president who seems to get mad when this country is crossed. And even if the substance of it isn't particularly dramatic, I just think that he's gaining on that. I think the Democrats had a hard time opposing him on a number of the things that he's done. The global warming, dropping out of the Paris Treaty was an exception, but I have the sense, if they're more focused on collusion with Russia and obstruction of justice, it seems to me that attacking Trump on dropping out of the Paris Treaty kind of fell flat. Do you hear much about it?
No, I agree. That was a huge issue for 3 days, and now it's like, what was that about?
Yeah, I think I come down where Jeff did, and Yeah, I obviously, when I was in the Senate, was a strong free trade proponent. I'm not sure how many, I mean, again, it goes back to, sort of electoral calculus too a little bit. And I think Republicans were maybe surprised, maybe even shaken a little by how Trump was able to attract the voters he did, and attribute at least some of that to, his policies on some of these issues. Maybe a lot to those policies, because in places like Michigan and Pennsylvania, it seemed to work. So they may be rethinking about, what the Republican free trade position, what's a coherent free trade position in this kind of world. It is really hard to go back and reassemble the Reagan coalition. And for three old guys like us to say it's a good thing is fine, but the truth is, if you're running for office today, the pillars on which it stood have disintegrated to a certain degree. You already referenced the Cold War a couple of times. That was a major pillar. The second pillar was, I think, economic, but really was much of it was taxes and tax policy. Well, the middle class joined that coalition to get tax relief, and they've gotten lots of tax relief in the last 30 years. And they no longer, when now they're more likely to respond to a Bernie Sanders tax appeal than they are to a Republican tax appeal that sort of argues for things like capital gains tax reform or business, the corporate tax reform. That doesn't affect the voter type, that we're talking about. So I think that, that disintegration of the, and then there's the social issues, were the third leg, which I think still is important of keeping a winning coalition together for the Republicans. But how do you keep the rest of it together without the Cold War and with the tax issue lost? And I think that Trump basically went out and found some other issues that maybe we don't agree with, but which appealed to that working class voter in Michigan and other places that had been voting Democrat in the last few campaigns.
Very interesting. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Spence. Thank you all. And
Thank you.
You're getting out in 10 minutes. Is that right? Welcome back. I think you have biographies of these two, but Neera Tanden runs the Center for American Progress, was senior advisor and had a senior role in many Hillary Clinton campaigns and offices, I think, over the years. And Doug Stosnick, senior political and strategic advisor in the Bill Clinton White House, and done many other things. Wrote an excellent memo that I recommend 2-3 years ago, which I think someone recently reposted, predicting that there's going to be a wave of populism that could overwhelm the establishments of both parties. And that was early, right? What was that, 2014, 2013 maybe? Yeah. You should quit now. You should just sit there quietly for this whole panel and, look like you're very sage, So. Anyway, it's great to have both of you. You've given as much thought to the Democratic Party as Spence and Jeff have to the Republican Party. I don't know, where do we stand? It seems to me Jeff and Bell and Spence Abraham their view is the Republican Party is more deeply divided than the Democratic Party. On the other hand, it's the Democratic Party had equally closely, 45% of Democrats voted for Sanders in 2016, as 45% of Republicans voted for Trump. In the one race we've had, big race, the Virginia governor's race, there was a hard-fought Democratic primary. So is it sort of, everyone's a progressive now and there's slight differences in tone and attitude, or is there really a Hillary Clinton worldview and a Bernie Sanders worldview that are pretty far apart and they're going to battle it out, or one of them is going to defeat the other? Neera.
I'll go first. I think that there are cleavages. I would say they're overwhelmed at the moment by opposition to Trump. Yes. They may become more important or more real in a future where there's just a positive agenda we're litigating out. Although I think, the truth be told, there were a lot of mostly substantive agreement between even Hillary and Bernie Sanders. But in the debates we're having right now, the most notable thing is how unified the Democratic caucuses, which are relatively diverse ideologically, but have been incredibly unified in its relationship to Trump. So from Joe Manchin to Bernie Sanders, You know, there's a opposition to the Trump budget and to the healthcare bill, obviously. And I mean, I do think Trump had a moment where he could have started on infrastructure and perhaps cleavage to the Democratic Party, but instead chose to start on healthcare and therefore help unite the Democratic Party. But in the, you know, there wasn't a single Democrat that voted with Republicans on the ACA repeal, or I don't expect a single Democratic senator, even in the states that are up, to feel even a grave threat about voting on the ACA repeal. So that is creating a lot of strong will. I would note Bernie Sanders was somewhat critical of the ACA during the primary, but has been an incredibly strong champion of it and opposed to repeal in the time that we're in now.
Doug?
Well, I would say the Democratic Party is probably extremely united with no leader anywhere in sight.
Yes, that's true. I would agree.
Maybe that makes it easier.
And, and I'd say the party is probably further to the left right now than at any time since 1972. And it will be further to the left a year from now than it is today. And it will be further to the left during the primaries than it will be a year from now. So I think the good news for Democrats is I think we are pretty coherent and united. The bad news is, well, we have several sets of bad news, starting with the fact we have a lost decade of not having elected officials across the country. We got wiped out for the last decade. We don't have a leader. The average age in the House of the Democratic leadership is 77 years old. The four, it's really 77. The four most prominent Democrats right now in the debate, with President Obama to the side, you know, 70, Biden and Sanders are in their mid-70s, Warren and Clinton are in their late 60s. So we have real problems about a generational leadership that we need to develop. And we will not be united as a party with a single voice until we have a nominee. And once we have a nominee, they will either become the president and they will stand for what the party is. For better or for worse right now, you've got that with Trump on the Republican side. And if we run in 2020 and lose, then we'll have the 5th year of no leader.
Yeah, so I think I see it slightly differently. I mean, if you look back at 2009 and 2010, the leaders of the Republican Party there were John Boehner and Mitch McConnell, who are many things, but inspiring figures of grassroots mobilization they are not. Yet a Tea Party was created and mobilized in opposition to the then Obama agenda. I see greater political activism than I have ever seen in my lifetime. More people engaged politically, more people calling, more people going to offices, more people taking political action than we could get happen any time during the Obama presidency. Those people are not inspiring to act because Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi are telling them to. They are inspired to act because they are essentially affronted by the values they see every day coming from Washington. And they're taking action themselves. And leaders are following them. They are not leading them. They're like following the mobilization. And, you know, I guess what I would say is that I think we're going to have 20 people run for office, for president in the future. We learned something from the Republican primary, which is to have a lot of people run. And I think, I'm not going to take bets, but I would imagine it's likely that it's someone just like in 92 or 2008. The person who's likely to be the Democratic nominee is not the leader of the party today. But someone who can both inspire, both be outside the Washington process and not be a captive of Washington, and perhaps create a different kind of coalition than we saw in 2016. I think the leaders, there are a lot of leaders. They're not ranking chair members, but they are like leaders like Cory Booker, Chris Murphy, Governor Bullock from Montana has a great message, or a whole stable of leaders out there. Elizabeth Warren for sure, so, Vice President Biden, but also people who are, you know, freshman senators who are going to compete for the presidency.
But I agree, though, one of the worst things you can be in the opposition party is you're a congressional party. And that, in general, is the worst face you can present to the American public. That's particularly true in 2017. Mm-hmm. There is a tremendous amount of energy out there. We have the three greatest political organizers for the Democratic Party this century was Bush, Obama, and Trump. And the level of energy out there right now, pivoting off of Trump, is something I've never seen in my lifetime. But the leadership is, I think, going to come from out there. It's not going to come from here. And the leaders are trying to keep up with the rank and file who are out there every day feeling like maybe they didn't in 16, but they do now. They understand politics matters.
And so how much, I mean, the anti-Trump seems to be for an opposition party in Congress when you don't have the majority and you and you're opposing a president who your own party really, really dislikes, and a fair chunk of independents aren't crazy about, and some Republicans. I mean, do you need anything more, honestly, for 2018? You just need adequate candidates to show up and adequate funding, and it just becomes a referendum on Trump? I mean, what would worry you about a kind of confident?
I think the most important races in 2018, this is my view, are the governor's races. So in governor's races, governors do need an abiding agenda. I mean, I do think it's vital to take the House back, but you have 34 governor's races, I believe.
36 and 8 next year.
I thought it was 2 this year and 34. But, you know, I defer to Doug. I always defer to Doug. So anyway, we have a lot of governor's races, and they are in states that should, you know, have the vast majority of them have had a Republican governor for two terms, so could easily swing. So I think those people need a actual affirmative agenda about how they're going to solve their state's problems, but I think will benefit from a anti-Trump mood in the country if it still permeates a year from now. I mean, I think Ed Gillespie a year ago looked like he was in better position than he does today. I mean, we talked about this a minute ago. I was personally heartened by the level of turnout in the Democratic primary. And, you know, and obviously Tom Perriello got on board very quickly because I think the energy in the party right now is to win. It's much more about unity and winning than it was in 2016 after 2 terms of a Democrat. And people are hungry for that. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about the left and the right, or the moderates versus the left. John Ossoff is in Georgia. He's raised $23 million, probably from a lot of progressives, right? But he's a pretty moderate candidate as these things go, hasn't endorsed single payer. And so I do think the overriding issue right now is interest in winning, because people, you know, it's not like you have an affront on your values like 5 times a week. It's usually like liberals kind of feel they have an affront on their values 5 times before 8 a.m. because they've experienced 5 tweets. So, so I think that has been very unifying.
And I think, to answer your question, I think, speaking as a Democrat, I think there must be 2 in the room.
It's fair and balanced, you know.
The bar for what we have to do in 18 is lower than people think in terms of, I think, the message, and it's higher in 2020
Talk about that,
than people think. And the last thing is on governors. If you look at the lost decade for Democrats, it all goes back. The original sin was 2010. Yeah. And Democrats got wiped out. And there are 75% of the countries have governor's races. Half of them are open seats. There are 9 Republican-held governor's seats right now that Hillary Clinton carried in 2016. There's only 1 state, Pennsylvania, that's up. The Democrats have the Trump carried. And so for the viability of the party in the long term, the biggest stakes are the governor's race. And the last thing I'll say is the structure is bad for Democrats in 2018. It's structurally bad because midterm elections have been, since 2006, poison for Democrats, the off years, in terms of who turns out. Given the Senate class that's up right now, there are very few opportunities for Democrats to pick up seats when all we need is 2 or 3. And then in the House, because of reapportionment redistricting, it's not to say Democrats can't take the House back, but it's a lot harder than it should be because of how the lines have been drawn. The advantages for Democrats is historically the first term, midterm election in general is good for the opposition party. And I think Trump is setting all kinds of new standards as president, and I think his possibility of becoming an anchor for Republicans could be as high as any time since Nixon in the 70s. But Democrats have these structural problems which could limit our ability to reap as big a benefit as we might normally be able to if Trump is, is as big a problem down the road as he is now.
So can I just add to that? I mean, one of the million-dollar questions is Democrats had a bad off year in 2002, had a great off year in 2006, but obviously had a bad off year, very bad off year in 2010, 2014. What really happened in 2010 and 2014 is Democratic turnout was very low, much lower than the presidential, and Republicans turned out at relatively high levels. So if you look, but I mean, I think we do have some indicia just from the recent races we've had. We've had 3 special election races. The first round in Georgia 6, Kansas 4, and Montana at large. Kansas 4 and Montana at large have skewed very Republican. But what you see in those races is that Democratic participation is around 70–75% of the presidential, which is like much higher than it was in 2010 or 2014. Republicans are dropping from their presidential from 2010–2014 levels to 55–60%. Now, those are so skewed that they're 65 in some places, and Karen Handel may do a lot better because of the level of interest. But lots of things change between now and 2018. But so far, you see a kind of 2006 scenario where Democratic participation is relatively high and Republican participation has gone a little lower.
We are 16 months away, so we don't know where we'll be.
Yeah.
Hopefully we'll still be here. But the level of anger for Democrats is much more intense than it was in 2006 after the war.
Yeah.
And the challenge for us as Democrats is because it's been hard right now. Democrats don't know how to meaningfully express their anger in a way that, other than feeling better, that they feel like they're doing anything about it. And so our challenge is to convince them that voting in the midterms is a way to express their anger that can have a meaningful outcome.
In the prior panel, Jeff Bell and Spence Abraham, I think, agreed on this point that I hadn't actually thought of much, which is there'll be some, well, who knows when the special counsel reports and what he reports, but if 2018 is a impeachment referendum in effect, and everyone thinks if the Democrats win the House, they impeach, and it's all about that, is that actually, their point was that could be worse for Democrats, not better. I mean, I suppose it's very motivating, but it will motivate Republicans more the other way than a normal midterm would. And it sort of changes the topic from, aren't you sick of, don't you think one party shouldn't control everything, which has always been a very strong off-year election theme, obviously, after a new president wins, 94, 2010, et cetera. In a weird way, it sort of becomes another presidential election. And, whatever Trump's popularity or lack thereof, that's a better playing field, oddly, for the Republicans than a kind of more standard, don't you hate the health care bill, they're giving tax breaks to the rich, and anyway, don't you need someone to check Trump? I mean...
So, let me get this right. So, the Republican strategy is an impeachment strategy? That's the offense?
No, it's just being analytical, Doug, just thinking things through.
I would say, just to be
well, Trump seems to think so, right? Since he seems to be inviting almost.
That's the grand strategy.
Okay, here's my serious spiritual question. And this I half believe. A health care debate is now more dangerous for Republicans than an impeachment debate.
So I
mean, the health care bill is so bad politically, it seems to me, as a Republican. I mean,
yet they're hurtling to pass it in the Senate.
Don't you think that you would prefer to have a Democratic? Isn't Ossoff right to say, Trump, he's doing all these things wrong, but I'm not about Trump. I'm about, more standard Democratic legislative proposals as opposed to the Republicans, or not?
So
or is it inevitably about Trump? I mean, I'm open-minded.
So I'm going to completely defer to Doug Sosnick, who actually worked on this issue of impeachment for President
Clinton. Had a good
and actually we did win 5 House seats, so I will defer to him. But I do think that there is a substantial difference, which is the impeachment scenario is, I would imagine that Mueller finds that the president has obstructed justice or taken some other series of illegal acts, colluded with Russians, and laundered money with the Russian mafia, whatever it is. The Republicans refuse to act because obviously they will choose not to impeach.
So
And
Mueller
that-
reports in mid-18 that there may be whatever.
Like next summer, there's a bunch of illegal. I mean, if there's
Right.
nothing, there's nothing. It will come off the table. But what's like, I
Right.
think the scenario is that we have a special prosecutor who finds, as well as pretty esteemed guy who finds illegal acts. Republicans choose to do nothing, and that will come back to haunt Democrats. And I think the issue here is that I tend to doubt that myself. I do think candidates will actually run on health care, but you will have a group of liberals who will definitely raise a lot of money to say that is actually a challenge for American democracy. You find illegal acts and Republicans choose to do nothing, and I don't think that will redound to their benefit. But
So, talk about impeachment for a minute. It's the first time in 20 years I've enjoyed talking about impeachment. There were three reasons why we did reasonably well in '98 during impeachment. One was things were going well in the country and the economy. Two is we believed in the White House that the third rail we could never touch was that there was a perception that the president's personal problems impacted his ability to govern. So we never could betray the notion that his personal foibles were impacting the job he was hired to do. And the third reason, which gets back to the Democrats, is we did well because of how Republicans looked like rabid dogs who were partisan, didn't care about the country, and they were one of the main reasons we did well. So a big issue in 2018 is going to be how the Democrats handle it. Last thing I'll say about impeachment. What we said to Clinton in the White House 20 years ago was the Democrats can't remove you, I mean the Republicans can't remove you from office, but the Democrats can.
Yeah.
And so we knew that we couldn't lose them, period. And for the Republicans, I think for now and the next 18 months, the only people that really matter, I think, for Trump's impeachment world are Senate Republicans. They're the only people that are going to impact his ability. The House of Representatives is functionally the Tea Party wing of the Republican Party. And no matter how badly Trump's polling is, in those districts that constitute the majority of those members, you can't walk away from those voters and walk away from Trump and hold your seat. So in the short term, the Senate Republicans, that is where his fate is held. In the longer term, the outcome of the House races in 2018 and whether the Democrats take control is where, because essentially removing a president from office is mostly a political act, it's not a legal act. And the political venue to exercise that is going to be in the Congress. And the only reason the Republicans are going to walk from Trump is if they can't afford to keep lugging him around.
While we're on this pleasant trip down impeachment lane, I just want to...
Can I just say one additional point to this, which is, I do think that there is a kind of, I mean, I worked in the White House during the impeachment proceedings, and I was one of the lieutenants or like soldiers who listened to the orders of people like Doug Sosnick, who said, you know, we have to focus on the business of the people every day. That included what the president himself said, but also what we did day to day. And I think the real challenge for the White House is that the president's tweets and his actions belie a notion that he's like utterly focused on the business of the day, because if you were, you would not be tweeting Fox and Friends appearances of your lawyers.
Well, his narrative is the opposite. I actually had this argument with a Republican over the weekend. I mean, from his own point of view, I think I'm interpreting you right, Doug, but correct me. Trump should be, from your point of view, on the Clinton model at least, saying, look, whatever they do, they do. I mean,
I'm innocent.
I can't control it. I know I'm innocent. I'm going to be vindicated. Meanwhile, here's my agenda on whatever the hell, infrastructure or trade or something. And in fact, it's the opposite. His line is, they're stopping me from governing these literally, isn't that the investigations are distraction? I think that's what, from governing it, is making it impossible to govern, and that's why I'm so angry all the time. But that seems to be the opposite of what Clinton did, no?
And you can't govern with a Republican Congress. The biggest fear I had about Trump, which I no longer worry about, was I thought the office and the job, he would become normalized.
Yeah.
And I'm not worried about that. He's not going to become normalized. We're not holding our breath for the pivot. This is his deal. He's 71 years old. This has worked for him his whole life. Most 71-year-olds are not reinventing themselves in terms of who they are and how they operate.
how much do you think, I'll just ask this question as a Republican, and how much do you think Trump is now the Republican brand and is for the foreseeable future?
Oh, he is the brand.
I mean, you guys will try to make it that, but it could have. No, I'm not being. I'm actually
an
honest analyst.
But I just think
could
it's
a clever Republican,
for good or bad. Like a congressional party can't overcome their presidency. Like the White House, Barack Obama, there are moderate Democrats who are different from Barack Obama, but like in every election, Barack Obama was the most important thing in the minds of voters. And Donald Trump does things to like seep himself into the minds of voters even more than any other president. I mean, literally, I go places, and if he does not tweet, people are like, was he golfing? Is he drinking? Is he sleeping? Like, why isn't he tweet? You know, like we actually think about why he's sending a 3 a.m. tweet. Like, actual people are wondering how he spends his time because he interacts in such a unusual way. So I think he's even more deeply enmeshed in terms of. I mean, I didn't see this. I think in the election, he did an incredibly skillful job of differentiating himself from the Republican Party. There were lots, again, I defer to Doug, but there were lots of Obama-Trump voters who were like, he hates Republicans, so he's not a normal Republican. I don't like Republicans either, but I'm going to vote for him because he's not a Republican.
Shake things up. Yeah.
Well, two things. One is, first of all, there were a lot, much to the surprise of the Clinton campaign, Sanders Trump voters.
Yeah.
And there were
8%.
a lot of them in Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. But back to your question, and not only do you remember this, you probably had something to do with this. You were in grammar school. But Jimmy Carter was president of the Democratic Party from 1976 until 1992. Mm-hmm. And the reason why is the Republicans kept him as the face of the Democratic Party.
So the counter-argument to that,
be hopefully successful for 20 years.
which will cheer me up, is Nixon. And weirdly, the Republicans recovered more quickly from Nixon. I mean, 74 was horrible, was a horrible blowout, obviously. But Ford, there was the Reagan-Ford primary, but Ford almost won in 76, and in fact, then of course Reagan in 80, et cetera. So, I mean, one could argue, this is my optimistic scenario, that Trump gets, forced out of office like Nixon. We need to have a new vice. Ford had the advantage of not having been his vice president, so there were a lot of weird things happening when you think about the 70s. But it is a very, you would have thought, I would have thought, I think historians would have thought that Nixon would have damaged the Republican Party for longer. He did kind of misbehave in office, but it seemed like he went away pretty quickly in terms of the Republican image. But I don't know that that's doable
so this
with
is
Trump.
The thing. There's this conversation.
It's a question.
Even amongst liberals, there's this whole conversation of Trump as Nixon or as Goldwater, which is, so, the theory is scandals can basically, a scandalized president you can recover from, the opposing party can recover from quickly, or the party in power can recover from, a party that goes way out of whack, and ideologically holds the party for a longer time. I say this to my friends who debate this, which is the beauty of Trump is you get both, right? So we do have an agenda, people may agree with it, but it is this agenda on healthcare, on the budget, on taxes, is to the right of what many issues we were discussing in the 1990s. I mean, some of it goes back to the contract with America on Medicaid, but the tax policies are to the right of Reagan's. And we might have, and we may well have, a scandal of proportion to Nixon. So I don't know which one we have, but what's energizing, there are lots of people energized on the progressive side who don't care that much about Russia, but deeply care about health care or the budget, et cetera. And we do have, you have the ability to operationalize both elements.
So I think something else was going on then, which was the Republican Party, the modern Republican Party that lasted until the summer of 2005, where I think the combination of Katrina and Terry Schiavo and the war and all that, and the Republican Party's been kind of roaming around for the last decade, and woke up and you had a hostile takeover in the middle of the night. But the Republican Party was that party was born in '64, right, and it had a pretty good run until 2005. But in '76, while Reagan lost the nomination, he took the party over in Kansas City. And so the party was going through a transformation from a northeastern, midwestern, moderate party to a southern, southwestern Main Street party that Reagan took over. So essentially, that was a process that was going on at the same time that Nixon, who represented the old wing of the party, was being run out. And so these larger forces, in Prop 13 and 78 was really the foundation for a quarter of a century of policy of this country. So that's really how the party was able to shed Nixon. It was because it was going through this profound transformation. Now what's happened here is you had 10 years of a party that stood for nothing, and Trump has taken it over. And so now Trump is the leader of the Republican Party.
Well, that's interesting. And it's harder to put back, it's harder to say, wait a second, there's another Republican Party. It's the party of Ben Sass and Nikki Haley and Pat Toomey and all these other people whom I would prefer to be the party of, but the voters are going to say no. He's the actual first Republican president in a decade, and he's going to be Republican president for some amount of time. And
biggest victory in history.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
Ever.
I mean, if you want to cheer up your progressive
Maybe
friends,
Lincoln. Maybe Lincoln was a better president.
No, John, I mean, if you want to cheer up your progressive friends, the model people should think of is Johnson. I mean, Johnson, ended 36 years in which the Democrats controlled the presidency for 28 of them, except for when the greatest war hero of the modern of the World War II was elected, and managed to destroy the party so much that they ended up winning one 4-year term in the next 26 years. So my math's so good. 16 years.
There are two reasons for that. One, he knew and acknowledged, and the other he lamented on. One was he felt like he got stuck with the Vietnam War when Kennedy actually did it.
Right.
Yeah. When he when he got the civil rights movement done, he said on the phones to Long from Georgia, this is the end of the Democratic Party of the South with this legislation. And he knew exactly what the political consequences were for shoving that through.
But also the war and the riots and all that. I mean, I think the Republicans were able to capitalize off that failed presidency, what was viewed as maybe unfair, as a failed presidency for quite a while. I'm just strengthening really the point.
Yeah.
Not arguing with it. I mean, it's. What about the Democrats? Could there be a Trump effect among Democrats in this way? What Trump showed is that in the modern party system, we discussed this a fair amount in the first panel, the structures of the party aren't as strong as one might have thought. An outsider can do a hostile takeover. And I think it's conventional wisdom, even among political scientists, that compared to the old days, money is more important. Communication is out of control of the established organs of the party. People don't defer the way they used to elected officials. You know, Barack Obama won had been in the Senate for 4 years. That was unusual. I mean, could you have a lot of Trumps? I don't mean this in a judgmental sense, or just an analytical sense. Wealthy businessmen, outsiders, famous people, celebrities running for Democratic primaries for governor and Senate in 2018 or even in 2020, or is the party somehow, is the structure a little stronger on the Democratic side?
So I have two thoughts about this. One is that my general take is that the opposing party, like in recent history, tends to pick the person most opposite to the president. Right, so Barack Obama in 2008 was the most opposite amongst the people running of George W. Bush, both substantively with the Iraq War and kind of temperamentally, and with his message of hope and change and inclusion. And if you actually have a mental image of Barack Obama and try to come up with the opposite of that person, it is Donald Trump. So I don't know it might be that we just in 2020 we have so much ADD as a country that we're basically like, you should be like the most boring person who actually knows how to run the government, and like we're going to give it to that person. The one thing I would say that, of course, I had this realization like far too late in the political process, but the Democratic Party, except through death, has not picked anyone over 52 since Wilson, right? So Roosevelt was 50. I don't count Truman because that's through death. Kennedy.
It's not to winner.
Winner. Yeah, winner. I mean, Ally Stevenson did it.
Carter. Yeah.
Carter. Well, Johnson is through death, I think. But Carter was 52, and then obviously Obama and Clinton. And I think that there's actually, I mean, we talk about party structures. I don't think party structure is all that important. I do think it is important for us to figure out a message of political reform and political change. And whether a person inside the political process can do that or outside the political process can do that, I'm not so sure. But I don't think we're going to, so we might go with someone who's under 52, like young and different, who's been, like, at least knows a basic amount of the government. I don't know that we're going to go for, like, a business guy who doesn't know anything about Washington after Trump, but you know, I mean, I think
or,
like 40
or even at the
people
state
run.
level. I know it's 28. I'm just.
Oh yeah, at the state level, and I would
Just a
say
question about what's actually happening on the ground.
Oh, at the ground level,
in
you know.
2018, are the Democratic nominees in most of these states, these governor's elections, Doug mentioned that are so important,
I mean,
going to look pretty much like normal, traditional Democratic nominees?
At the congressional level, I mean, they have a lot of fascinating. They have a lot. I mean, they're recruiting Iraq veterans. There's a guy now who just, I think, announced over the weekend against, who's like an iron worker. You know, I think they are trying to recruit. I mean, I don't know if they're trying or people are just stepping up, but there are a lot of people who are outside the political process who are running in these congressional races who aren't like typical like county legislators. Right. They're like running for the first time. Who have all kinds of different experiences.
So I just read one thing you said. I think the role of money being so important is greatly exaggerated.
Me too. I agree.
And I think if you look at the congressional primary in Georgia that set all these records, our guy's not doing well because he's a great fundraiser. You know, the money follows the narrative.
Yeah.
And if you have a strong and compelling narrative, you'll get the money. And you can do it. You can do it in 24 hours now. So.
No, I'm a message Trump's money guy too on that. But do you think the messengers there will be? So you think? I'm just curious. So 2018, you think? So maybe some fresh faces at the congressional level.
I think you're going to have a lot of congressional level. I think, I mean, at the governor's level, it does seem like who people are shaking out are existing office holders so far, but I don't know if that'll be universally.
So I'm going to pretend like I'm answering your question.
Okay, say whatever you want. It's okay.
I think the leaders going forward, and I'm not sure about 18 because it takes a while, but the leaders going to go forward are going to be people who are leaders in their communities. They're not going to be part of the political class. We've gone since Eisenhower until Trump with the political class. Now you could argue, well, maybe the political class isn't so bad, but I think that increasingly, I think the leaders of our country are going to be people who are leaders in their communities and come from, at least by today's standards, not traditional types of candidates. And those are going to be the people that are going to be running this country 10, 15, 20 years from now. It's not going to be the suits in Washington.
And what will they be arguing? So, I mean, is the conventional view by people like me who, just before Bill Clinton, kind of agreed with him on X percentage of issues, that there are no more Bill Clinton Democrats? Even Hillary Clinton had to stop being a Clinton Democrat when she came out against TPP and, you know, pretended to be, I don't know, dovish on all kinds of things. Maybe that one she didn't pretend so much. But, I mean, how serious is the move to the left of the Democratic Party? And whether you like it or not, I mean, it's another issue, but... Doug, and then Nira.
I think a little bit disagree with Doug on the point of where the party will go into the future. I think the challenge on economic issues is that, I mean, there's a million different lessons people like learn from 2016, but I think, you know, our takeaway is that we actually have to have some better immediate answers on what to do on jobs and wages, particularly for people who kind of think the Democratic Party is basically against them, which they've been told or we've done things about. I mean, I don't need to litigate the cause. I think that there are debates in the party between, you know, there's like big debates about single payer or redistributionist issues, and I think you'll have a bunch of governors run in the future who have to kind of think through that, how to have an answer on the immediacy issue. Like, from my perspective, I think where Hillary lost a lot of ground on the issues front is that as progressives, we think like, oh, Trump didn't have issues. It was all character attacks and it was all like a show. But I think that like kind of misses the point. If you're a 50-year-old guy who works at a plant in Iowa and you have a message of like, their economic messages go to college or like free college or making college easier, or another message is we're going to punish anyone who outsources and ban immigrants. You know, I don't like the ban immigrants message, but one is about my job today. Another one is like how my kids will do, or it's about me transforming my life to go to college, but I don't want to do that. I would prefer to live my life and have a good job. And I think for progressives, we actually, I mean, it's our view at CAP that we actually have to have a better answer for people of how they're going to do better in this economy with globalization and automation happening, creating a lot of pressures on them. And no answer is not ever going to be a bad answer.
But we went through probably from Reagan until probably say 14. Because you think about the 16 presidential election, the two most dominant people running out of the 20 were Sanders and Trump,
right,
in terms of controlling the narrative. And the fact of the matter is that they had more in common than not. And so for about 25 years, we had the same fight and the same debate on the same issues. But it's like an Etch-a-Sketch. We're starting to change where the lines are going to be drawn. And it's not the same old lines based on the same old lineups of people. And so as a going forward matter, you're seeing it on things like privacy and a variety of other issues. You know, some of the left and some of the right coming together over here, and some of the people over here on trade, a variety of issues. So I think the cleavages in our society are going to be a lot different in terms of how they've been broken out politically than what we've seen since most of us started in politics.
Yeah, but I would just say on that, I mean, I think this is the interesting question, why Trump didn't follow through with more of the economic populism. You know, because that would have been, I mean, to your point, like he did reshuffle the deck, and I think he did attract a number of people who voted Democratic in the past because he was willing to take on his own party, attack his own party, and take positions that were new. Trade is obviously one. But, you know, on Social Security, Medicare, other issues. And what I find weird about it is that he had an opportunity to drive those cleavages in. Instead, I mean, he's united the Democrats against him. Bernie Sanders may, like, agree with him on some issues, but, like, there is no time or place or anything where he will say, I think Trump's really right about this. You know, he will, because he'll get so much blowback from other elements of the party. So that's what I find sort of weird about the moment, which is he could have reformulated, but chose to basically, and I think maybe it's because he didn't have a lot of experience with Congress and he just kind of deferred to the congressional agenda to them, but chose, you know, to take on an issue that he knew would unite the Democratic Party against him, which is health care, an issue that people have been litigating for a long time, instead of doing infrastructure, which he could have, like, you know, I had a great fear. He's going to start with infrastructure, he'd break Democrats immediately. Those moderate senators in the immediate aftermath of the election would be freaked out. He could have, like, pulled them in immediately. He would have had to say no to some of the far right of the Republicans, but he could have created a cleavage in the middle and just chose not to.
Well, I can explain a little bit of that. I mean, beyond the fact Trump doesn't know anything about these issues, doesn't care about these issues, doesn't read about these issues, has probably never read a book about these issues. He ran for president to win and to get elected. He had no theory of what he wanted to do when he became president. There was no organizing principle about his presidency. And we spent the second half of Clinton's first term cleaning up the first half of Clinton's first term. And we finally, when we've got a do-over at the beginning of the second term, we actually knew what we were doing, and we were pretty effective. But the arc of a presidency is set in those first year. I mean, you go back to Reagan with the PATCO strike, which is, the country didn't really care about the air traffic controllers, but the PATCO strike that he broke, I think in August of '81, defined his presidency and put the Democrats in Congress on notice they can't mess with him. And so he has squandered the most valuable period of time in his presidency because other than winning, George Bush in '88, he wanted to become president because that was the last job they hadn't gotten. And once he got elected, he achieved his goal. And then he had to hang around for 4 years and wait for the next election. And this guy had no purpose for governing. His goal was to win.
But it is, I
find. But it's weird. Even Steve Bannon, though, like, that's what I get. I mean, I'm not saying that he would figure out, but I guess what I don't really understand is Steve Bannon was, like, signaling in the aftermath of the election that we're going to do gigantic jobs things and, like, basically break the Democratic Party in two by pulling all these Democrats to their side. And, like, you know, I mean, I'm not a Steve Bannon fan by any stretch, but, like, he had a theory of the case, which was to create a populism in the country. I mean, let's be candid, a white populism in the country that is a lot similar to what far-right candidates have done in Europe, which is to be social welfare liberals marked by racism. And so, like, I find fascinating is you had a person who kind of won on that agenda. A million things happen, obviously, so you can't just say one thing, but he was able to attract a group of people to vote for a Republican that did not vote for McCain or vote for Romney, and that is why he won Midwestern states. We think about Michigan and Wisconsin, but he, Ohio and Iowa swung by like 15 points, right?
She watches Saturday Night Live too long. She thinks Bannon's the president, and he's not the president. Trump's president.
Oh, I get that.
But it is weird.
I get that,
but
it
he
is.
succeeded
But
running against Republicans, and then he became the most partisan Republican soon after becoming president. I remember seeing one of his first tweets was just attacking the Democrats. And I thought, well, why are you doing this? Don't you want to actually? I mean, I have no problem personally with attacking Democrats.
Just call
There's not an
Schumer
election
loser.
for 4 years. Why don't you try to get some Democrats to be for you? I mean, it just seemed a little odd. But he's not a partisan Republican.
Okay, well, I'm glad it didn't work out. But I'm just saying.
Is it too late? I mean, so what are you?
It is too late. It is too late. I mean, I have this crazy theory that Democrats will win the House, and then to win the presidency, he'll just accept all their bills, right? Like, we'll take the House and we'll be moderated, and he'll want to win again because it's just embarrassing to lose.
Clinton.
And so he'll just start voting. He'll just vote. He'll just like sign every Democratic bill. Which, truthfully, if you think about it, you're worried about it too. Yeah. Now that I've said it, but
you think in the first 2 years now, Trump's course is marked. There's no. As you said, I've been laughing about the pivot for a year myself, but I mean, you think?
I just think at this point, it's not that he just like does these things. It's just that he has spent like 5 months gaining power amongst Republicans by attacking liberals, right? He didn't. It's not like it's like all that's feeding this is like you hate the same team I do, and he's like living off that by tweeting against Democrats and say just every opportunity is to get his core supporters energized by their opposition to Democrats. And it's just like, I just think he's so toxic amongst Democrats. It's hard to see how you could get multiple, like, serious votes for his agenda.
We both worked on campaigns and in government. Governing is hard.
Yep.
Campaigns are pretty easy.
Yeah, governing is much harder.
And to govern, you've got to have a theory of what you're doing. Yeah. You have to spend your political. You have to be strategic.
You have to think long term.
And Trump, as I tell my kids, they eat junk food. It's it's just this mass. They either put sugar on it or they put salt on it, and they eat it. And that's what they eat. And they're strung out after about 5 hours of that. And all Trump is tactics. All he is politics. All he is short term. There's no theory, there's no structure, and that you can't govern. And some of your most effective days in government are when you have a bad day on the short term, because it's a short term day that helps define what the longer term mission is. At the end of the day for Trump, his success politically going forward is going to be whether or not he impacted and improved people's lives. And that's going to be the tale of the tape. And in order to do that, unless he's the rooster who takes credit for the sunrise, which apparently he is, but unless people's lives are actually improved 18 months from now, 2 years from now, 2.5 years from now, then it's going to be really hard for him politically to get 4 more years from people. That's going to be the tale of the tape, not what happened on Rachel Maddow tonight.
Do you think he's vulnerable to a Republican primary challenge?
I do not.
What? You guys can cheer me up here or no? No.
I mean, I just think the problem is like he's the most compelling figure to 2/3 of the Republican Party on his worst day, right? So, until that gets to 48% instead of 2/3, it's really hard to see who is going to do that unless it's like some other actual billionaire who's going to self-fund some kind of giant message operation, which is really just hard to do. Trump has a lot of, he does blanket the airwaves. You can't just buy your space out of that. It's just
but I mean, reality, I suppose, would do it. I mean, Johnson was dominant, and then you fight God forbid, but you fall into a horrible war somewhere, or you have a bad recession or riots and stuff.
Yeah, but he was weakened in the party, right? He was weakened in the party.
Well,
and there was a big, I ask myself every day, like, what crazy is going to break the Republicans from supporting him? I mean, can we just say that you don't have to agree with Russian collusion, but like a cornerstone of Republican thought for the last 30 or 40 years has been not accepting Russian the Russian state or proto-fascism in the United States, and yet he, on every policy issue, every policy issue, EU, NATO, Ukraine, has kind of deferred to Russia. And they did the Russia sanctions
well,
bill,
maybe
but very
Russia
little
sanctions
criticism.
is a little bit of a,
That
canary in a coal
That
mine.
was the deepest cleavage. That's the first vote that people voted against him.
Come back to the Democrats, and we'll take some questions here. I mean, so on their future, I think the bill, let's just say in a, cartoon sort of, the Bill Clinton version of the Democratic Party versus the Bernie Sanders version of the Democratic Party, does that manifest itself as a sort of big fight in 2020, or is it sufficiently submerged by just A, history, and B, Trump, that it sort of, you don't quite get a clean litigation of those issues?
So I think that we understate, maybe I would defer to Doug on this. He would have a better sense of this than I do. But my theory is that we understate Bernie Sanders' appeal as an anti-status quo candidate. And I think anti-status quo candidates have been successful within Democratic primaries. Barack Obama was a pretty anti-status quo, had very deep criticisms of politics as usual. There's another candidate in '92 who had a lot of criticisms of politics as usual. His name was Bill Clinton. I think whoever is going to be successful in 2000 will have to marry a kind of 2020, a bold economic agenda, which may not be the most left, but will sound the most like real in your life, with a strong embrace of political reform. How Washington who can take advantage of the real feeling in the country that Washington is calcified and does not solve people's problems. Whether that might be the most left candidate, that might or it might be a more moderate. I don't think we're going to have like a DLC candidate win, but a more moderate candidate as governor or somewhere else. I do think there will be a deep hunger to win. So electoral viability might have more import in the middle of the Trump years than it did even at the end of both in 2000 and in 2016. We both had candidates who were more establishment, be the party bearer, but also there was an interest in third parties, there was a disinterest in seeing the consequences of the race in the Democratic side. Just because after 8 years, people are like, whatever. And I think you will not have that problem in 2020.
Well, first of all, the Democrats had enormous advantages building and going into 2016, and it turned out, I guess, it didn't matter. But those advantages haven't gone away. And so the Democrats have huge potential advantages that aren't going to be, that aren't going to leave us because we lost the election. However, I think our two biggest challenges is not that one. Our two biggest challenges is one, well, I think a lot of our views in general, people are going to gravitate towards, particularly younger people. The biggest challenge we have is, I think liberal Democrats' view of the role and size of government is not in line with the group of people you need to get 51% of the vote. So I think figuring out, although I think that Trump is helping people understand that having no role for government and no oversight, no regulations, and you'll see in several more years a high-risk act of them not doing anything in terms of the implications of people's lives. But the one challenge for Democrats is going to be to figure out the right way to articulate an appropriate level of government that's in sync with what I believe to fundamentally still be a center-right country. The second challenge that we have, which I think is bigger than the one you mentioned, is the gap in perception that we are an elite party distant from the middle and working people of America. 70% of the people in this country don't go to college and get a 4-year degree. So, and this is part of running as an outsider. But that is our biggest problem, I think, right now, which is overcoming the notion that we're a bunch of East Coast and left Coast snobs who look down and use pejorative terms like flyover country and other kinds of terms that we heard in the 2016 campaign. That's the biggest challenge we have as a Democratic Party going forward. I think more than trying to litigate out the ideological differences we have between $12 an hour minimum wage and $15 an hour minimum wage.
I agree with that. I think also, but I would say, I think actually Trump understood that the country is less libertarian. I mean, I'm struck by, if you actually look at attitudes. I mean, there's a poll, I guess a month ago by Pew which said, you know, should the government do more to solve people's problems or do less to solve people's problems? I mean, that's like been a question that has, like, Democrats have lost, or the more libertarian answer has won for 40 years, right? It is part of the post-Goldwater period, which is to say the government is a failure, and you know, Democrats always litigate particular programs, but defending government in the abstract has always been like a dead bang loser. I think in a way, during the campaign, but not in governing, Trump saw that things had changed. So right now, that poll a month ago was 57% said the government should do more, not less. Again, terrible way to think about this. Now, it's moved. Now, I'm not saying that's like saying have a single payer system, okay? But I'm saying that in a litigation between the government being too big or too small, that has been like a conservative bulwark for a very long time. And the thing about Trump is he is not a libertarian. He is a big believer in doing big things to solve problems. And one of the reasons I think he did better in the election than many of us thought he would.
Well, the issue, and I'll give you an example, take energy.
Take what?
Energy.
Energy.
You ask people about, should we do renewables? It's overwhelming. When you start digging down and asking how much more per month they're going to pay for that, you find out that all of a sudden those big numbers collapse.
Yeah, so this is my point. I think that in the progressives there's a misunderstanding. Like, I don't think we're white, like, and nobody really is like, please tax me more, right? So if you can figure out a way, I think people are very tax sensitive, in part because wages have been struggling for a lot of people for a long time. But if you could think through an answer in which you're not saying their wages go up, like trade, or their taxes go up, like trade, where I'm going to help you, I'm going to keep your job here, and you're not going to have to pay for it, right? Because that is the way he thought about trade. Like, that had deep resonance, deeper resonance than you would have otherwise thought.
Well, I mean, it gets back to, for Democrats, you got to be able to articulate a vision of the future, that there's a role of government that doesn't make the majority of people in this country nervous that they're going to be spending money. Our taxes are lower than a lot of places in the world, and there's more dissatisfaction with our government because, unlike other places in the world that pay more, at least they feel like they're getting something for it.
Yeah.
In our country, we have a high tax rate, and people feel like, I mean, the metaphor I always use is, people think they drive down the road and there's construction going on and there are 12 guys there working on it. There's 6 guys supervising 6 guys. And then of the 6 guys who are working, there are 3 guys online supervising the 3 guys who are working.
And they're on break, a lot of them.
Yeah. So they say, well, we can get rid of 6 guys and we haven't lost any effort. And I think one of the problems for Democrats has been 8 years of Obama, there were some government programs that were difficult to justify and explain that they made a lot of sense economically. And so that's a big problem for us as Democrats.
And I think in '92, having been in the first Bush White House and getting clobbered by Bill Clinton, it helped a lot that we said governor of a tiny little state, field governor, all this stuff, but he was a governor of a moderate state, and there were enough people in Arkansas that had been a pretty good governor, though the state hadn't been transformed, that it was hard to just say, oh, come on, another big government liberal, Walter Mondale stuff. So I think, I mean, that would be important, I suspect, whether you have a congressional Democrat who will have had to vote for for every government program, basically, that exists, or a governor who said, no, I govern Colorado, and the state has I'm making this up, but it has a 4% unemployment rate, and new businesses, and blah blah blah.
But you're running against an incumbent. So you take 80, take 92. Really, there's a de facto in 88 and 08 and 16.
Yeah.
There's a hydraulics. The more dissatisfied they are with the incumbent,
yeah,
the more they're going to lower the bar of acceptability on the alternatives.
So, yeah.
And there's no way in the world that the Democrat who ran in 08 could have lost. Because they're not going to vote for a Bush third term.
Yeah. Questions?
Hi, I'm wondering, what sort of game plan do Democrats have to make inroads among religious voters? The stat I saw had Donald Trump winning overwhelmingly among evangelicals, but Hillary Clinton also lost a majority of Catholics, and Catholics had traditionally voted Democratic, and I'm just wondering if you know what the reason for that is. Maybe they were just viewed as being overly antagonistic toward questions of religious freedom or an open Supreme Court seat, but it seems to me Donald Trump could have done all the locker room talk he wanted to all day long, and he still won a majority of religious voters, and I'm wondering, what would you like to do to turn that around?
Doug?
Well, I think you take the Catholic Church as an example in terms of where the Catholic Church was 25 years ago, and when the Pope would come to town and who he wanted to meet with and who wanted to meet with him. Or you take the Pope coming to town now, and who wants to meet with the Pope, and where's the Pope aligned politically? I think that shows you, I think, a big change in the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. And I think there's also tremendous movement long term amongst religious community on a variety of issues, including the environment, as an example. And when you talk, you poll people about, you know, how you voted and all. You know, some people self-identify as religious and Catholic when they vote, and some people happen to be Catholic and maybe not go to church, and that wasn't the driver in there. But I think on a lot of social issues, and including the environment, the Democrats are having increasingly more in common with and a lot of, I'm sure that people in the room know more about that than I do, but a lot of younger people in the evangelical movement have decided to continue to have an impact in their community, but opt out of the raw political process because the notion of the ends justified the means became unacceptable for them. And so I think as we start resorting out the divisions in our country, I think Democrats have a real opportunity with those groups. It may take a while because of our shared interests, particularly social issues.
Yeah, I would say, I have to say, I found it kind of stunning how much evangelicals supported Trump after attacking the weakest amongst us or his personal behavior. But I think, you know, there are progressives who are trying to reach out to younger evangelical leaders who were the most outspoken in their criticisms of not even just personal stuff, but in terms of his policies on immigration or other issues where they found common cause in the past. There are a lot of evangelical supporters who've been actually phenomenally great on those issues. I don't know if the Catholic voters who voted for Trump were voting for him because of their Catholic position, or were voting for him for other reasons, economic or otherwise. So that's a little bit hard to pull out. But I do think there are voices amongst evangelicals who, particularly young leaders who are who've expressed concern about the kind of attitudinal views of Trump, whether it sounds like he's bullying people or whatever, who are themselves reaching out to a variety of forces.
I've had several social movement conservatives say a version of the same thing to me, which was basically, if Trump doesn't blow the world up, it's worth having him as president for 4 years for no other reason than the court.
Yep.
Period.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah, no, the court was a huge issue. This is the great irony. I said, so the court was a huge issue from my view in getting the reluctant Trump voters over the line at the very end. And there was a large number of them. It wasn't as if, it wasn't most of Trump's voters, but it wasn't 2% either. It was, enough to make him victory. And and the reason the court was so big, it would have been big anyway, obviously, so it would have been the next 4 years, but the real reason it was big was there was an actual vacant seat of the most famous conservative justice, who conservatives hated the idea of losing that, obviously, to the left. And why was that seat open? Why was that? Because the much derided establishment Republican whom all the Trump supporters hate, Mitch McConnell, through pretty impressive, I've got to say, inside baseball work with the Republican conference and managing to keep Susan Collins and everyone else on board, something that wasn't so easy to do, to hold that seat open for 9 months, managed to do it. So Trump owes his election to Mitch McConnell. I think that's just a factual statement. Trump does not win if that court seat is not open.
McConnell's legacy will be 2 seats on the court.
Yeah, and Trump is president.
Yeah.
Dave, I
have a small gauge hypothetical question. 2018, the Democrats take the House and they have 226 seats, and they take the Senate and they have 53 seats. And
that seems high.
Do they get rid of the filibuster?
No, I don't think so. That's my take.
What was Trump?
I think that a lot of people who have been anxious about the filibuster have now recognized its utility for guarding against insanity. And so I actually don't think that Democrats will. They have deep regret in the caucus of giving up the filibuster amongst of cabinet nominees. And I think there's actually, people might not like it in this room, but people amongst progressives are their ability to do damage is greater than our ability to do good. So let's keep the filibuster to keep things in line across the board.
They could get rid of it once they have a Democratic president in 2021, right?
What would the reaction of the resistance movement be if the first bill they bring up in 2019 is single payers, and they get to the Senate and they can't go anywhere.
I think the resistance movement will hope that the first thing is to impeach Trump, and will be relatively satisfied on that. I think single payer is not a uniform view of the resistance at this point, although it may well be into the future. But there are plenty, I deal with resistance groups every day, and many of them are supporting a single payer model. Many of them are just like, let's just defeat them on ACA and move on with our lives. So it's not a uniform view of the resistance, which is, a lot of the people fueling the resistance groups are Hillary Clinton voters. New activism is 86%. People who are taking the first political action, 86% of those people are women. The target group is middle-aged women, right? It is a lot of middle-aged women who are pissed off and fueling the resistance right now. They're the ones making calls. They're the ones going to town halls. They're bringing their daughters with them. And they are hugely motivated about Trump himself, less ideological across the board. That doesn't mean there are a lot of people who care deeply about single payer, and the insurance industry's silence in the face of this of the ACA repeal is making those voices stronger in the party, not weaker. But I don't see that as a demand of the grassroots at this moment.
I suppose if Mueller, we've never had an election, I believe, in which you would have a report. Nixon left office in the middle of '74. It had effects on the '74 election ultimately. But if Mueller reports to Congress in the middle of 2018, which I would think is the most reasonable
Probably
guess.
spring or summer.
Yeah, spring or summer, most reasonable schedule. He can't do it in 3 months, but he's not going to take 18 months, right? And if he reports, if he says there's nothing here that's impeachable, other people did things they shouldn't have done, they'll be prosecuted, blah, 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 then I suppose it kind of goes away, sort of. But if he says, and I guess the way these referrals work is you don't say he's done impeachable things, you say these are things that Congress should consider.
Yeah.
Is what Starr said, right? We think there's enough here for Congress to take up this issue. And that's hanging over a midterm election. Does that ever happen in American history? I'm just thinking I don't.
Well, 98.
Right, that's right, so 98. And that did have a weird, consequence doubly in the sense that first the Democrats picked up seats in an off-year election, and secondly, the Republicans went ahead and impeached Clinton anyway, so go figure it out, right?
We had the creepiest opposition you can imagine, though. We could not have been luckier.
But it will just be unusual.
Yeah.
I guess 98 was a referendum on impeachment as opposed to, but it was in a context of economic growth and so forth. Yeah, it's interesting. Adam?
So when the book is written on this era of our politics 20 years later, how will Democrats remember the Clintons?
I think the jury is still out on that.
Will they remember them separately or together?
I think they'll just aggregate them.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I would say.
President Clinton will be remembered for a guy who did a tremendous amount of really good things, and he much higher than he would like up on his obituary is going to be the problems he had with Lewinsky and all the rest of it, and they'll look back at what could have been in addition to what was.
Clearly in the 2016 election, Trump was very successful in bringing out white working class voters who were disaffected for a variety of reasons, globalization. In the earlier panel, there was a question about whether if Trump doesn't deliver in terms of jobs and other promises to this constituency, whether it would affect the Republican prospects for Congress in 2018 and ultimately for his presidency. But by the same token, for Democrats, they lost a key constituency in key states. Can they get them back? And you talked a little bit about that before, but what would be the kind of things that would actually work in getting white working class voters back into the Democratic fold?
Well,
let me just footnote the question. You guys talked to a lot of senators and congressmen and candidates. There are actual Democratic senators running for re-election in these states that Trump won, Michigan and Pennsylvania, et cetera, and there are certainly challengers and congressional candidates in open seats in these states. So what are they, just to sort of follow on the question, what should they do, but also what are they how are they dealing with the fact that Trump won their states?
I think this is like an interesting thing. Obviously, there was a lot of deeper anxiety, but if you right after he got elected. But I'll say Senator Manchin has been phenomenal on the issue of health care. I think he's taking a busload of West Virginians to come in this week and actually try to testify in a kind of markup that is not being permitted of any kind. So, you know, Heidi Heitkamp has been as has Claire McCaskill, has been really focused on the budget cuts to rural America. I think in terms of the committees, they are trying to recruit candidates who are sort of outside of the political spectrum. So there's an Iraq War veteran who's challenging Barbara Comstock. There's as I said, a 20-year-old person who's been an iron worker for 25 years, who's taking on no political experience at all, who's taking on Paul Ryan. I think they are trying to recruit for the districts. And I think John Ossoff's been an interesting race. He's not trying to be particularly polarizing in his rhetoric towards Trump, but has been very forceful on the issue of health care. So I think the 2018 elections, Democrats will run on a message of Trump has actually hurt his voters on health care, on the budget, on taxes. These are all ways he's actually not done or betrayed or hurt the people who came over to his side. And I think for 2020, we'll see a greater litigation of an affirmative agenda for those folks. Whether there's a strong appeal to those voters or just a view of the coalition. I hear most people, even considering running for president, think that they have to do both, defend civil rights and figure out strategies and policies and ideas that actually, not appeal to those voters, but actually would have actually help produce better economic results for those people.
How great is the tension? I'll ask, but so Ossoff's running in a kind of upscale Atlanta suburb. I live in Northern Virginia, Barbara Comstock's district. I think I can see what the right Democratic strategy would be there, which is just to hope Trump is really unpopular and then make Barbara Comstock a Trump defender, even if she doesn't always vote with him, because at the end of the day, the Republicans are the ones who are, propping him up and won't stand up to him. But it seems to me in the working class districts in Michigan and Pennsylvania, it's sort of that is the question of where is there a message from the Democrats there that it gets back the Democratic voters who went to Trump.
So politics is wonderful. Darrell Issa and Barbara Comstock are now moderate Republicans.
Yeah, I know. It's so crazy.
Isn't that awesome?
You have five members of Barbara from the 90s? Yeah.
Barbara Comstock voted against Stacey. Yeah, voted against Stacey.
Things. One is putting that withstanding the outcome of 2016, it's not a viable long-term strategy for the Republican Party to have their foundation built just on white working class voters. By the same token, Democrats just can't take a powder on that group and just say they don't count. And so I would say that we have to be able to present the fact that we care about them and that we are focused on them. Not forget about even results, but in ignoring them. If you ignore someone politically, you're never going to get the vote. The last thing I'll say is, it didn't start during the beginning of Obama's presidency, but by the end of Obama's presidency, if you told me three things about a person, I could tell you how they would come out on Obama. Remember, Obama basically never went under 40% job approval, never above 54% until the very end. And so these were like tectonic plates that never moved. So you told me a person's gender, their age, and their race. So you give me three out of those things, an older white male, I can tell you where they're going to come out on the Obama thing. The fourth now is becoming the most defining demographic, I think, in American politics going forward is going to be education.
Yeah, college versus non-college.
Education is the driver.
Is it that big as a kind of?
It's bigger than income. College versus it was more telling than income.
And so you look at if the Republicans lose the House, it's going to be a swath of states from Georgia all the way around up through California. It's 8 in California, and they're all disproportionately high education districts demographically. And the race tomorrow in Georgia is one of those. And that is so there's four elements now, and you really have a strong predictor of where a person is politically.
Yeah, the only thing I'd say is
gender, race, and education.
I mean, the thing is, Barack Obama, who had his challenges, won 37% white working class voters, Hillary, or 40% white working class voters, and did better in the Midwest than white working class voters elsewhere. Hillary got 27, 28%, so she got She did better with white college voters than most Democrats have done in a really long time. She got slaughtered with white non-college voters, which was a problem for her for a very long time. It did not just happen in the beginning. It happened kind of in the spring and moved on. You know, Democrats, even in these like states like Missouri, you know, they can do pretty well if they get to like 40 or 45% of white non-college. They don't have to win them, but they have to do a lot better than Hillary did. And so that's a question. That's a big, this is $1 million question, right? The $1 million question for 2018 is, are the white college voters who voted for Hillary in these suburban districts, are they going to vote Republican because it's like they're in the election, or are they going to vote Democratic out of, these are people who don't like Trump right now. They are fueling, like they have opposition to Trump. They're not supportive of him. And whether they take that out on the Republicans or they go along with the Republicans because they're kind of traditional Republicans is like the big question.
Final thoughts, Doug?
So Adam asked a question about 20, 25 years from now. He asked about Clinton, but I just think the one thing about this conversation today, that if 20, 25 years, I'm not sure how many of us will be on location 25 years from now.
Speak for yourself, buddy.
Of this location. But I think what this conversation is missed in terms of 25 years from now looking back is we're at a transition period in our country. And I think that these political parties are yet another relic of a failed institution that people are alienated from. And you know, Obama basically ran after Obama became president, he basically ran away from the Democratic Party as the label and stayed with Obama for America and all the rest. Trump ran against the Republican Party to take over the Republican Party. So I believe we're going to end up 20, 25 years from now, we're going to have, and this will put people to sleep, but we're going to have lots of electoral reform that's going to create a new system. You're going to have electoral college reform where states are going to do what Nebraska's done and Maine has done in terms of having CD votes. You're going to have nonpartisan reapportionment redistricting, maybe in the 30s. You're going to have campaign finance reform, jungle primaries like they have in California, the top two finishers. So you're going to end up with a massive transition like we're doing in everything else, where we go to Amazon and we don't go to JCPenney now. And you think about all the 20th century institutions that are failed. And I've put the Democrats and Republican parties in that bucket of failed institutions. So we could end up, and I think you'll have vibrant third and fourth and probably fifth party candidates in 2020. And if we were going to build the parties from today from scratch, we'd have a conservative party, we'd have a progressive party, we may have a Tea Party, we may have a Green Party. And so we're going to build...
We get to have a centrist Macron party?
Well, you can end up...
Couldn't you?
I mean, you could take a... the Republican Party is the Tea Party. And the Democratic Party, I think, is going to be from the old days and McGovern's of the 72s. And that's going to leave out a lot of people like that are kind of moderate Democrats. And I mean, there are the 40% that aren't of those two groups are social libertarians and economically fairly fiscally responsible people. And they actually constitute the largest group, and they're going to be, I think they're going to end up without a home. And I do believe we're going to end up 20, 25 years from now with these political reforms. We're going to end up with different alignments on political parties, and we're not going to just lug these two carcasses around 20, 25 years from now.
This was actually a bigger theme of the first panel. I wish we had spent more time on it. We have to, but I'll ask you one question, and then Nero, you talk. I mean, is this a 20-year thing, or is it conceivable in 2020 if it's Elizabeth Warren and Donald Trump? Is there a Macron possibility? I mean, just you've been through these elections. I mean, how deep are the structural barriers to that in the U.S., or are they overstated?
Well, we have barriers to entry, and what we haven't had is someone who is prepared to do what it takes to get ballot access and is a credible. I mean, Gary Johnson, before, you know, if he had never turned his microphone on,
he would have.
He could have gotten
in the debate.
So I believe that you could easily end up with an enormous middle lane for a person to run in 2020 outside of the two parties to be extremely viable. The last Wall Street Journal poll had both parties were like 15 points underwater, each of them. I mean, what's so special about these two parties other than the barrier to entry?
Yeah, I think the issue. I think the issue there is that the problem is you can never just like start afresh, and so in 2020, you'll have people who are trying to unite against Trump. Or, I mean, maybe you can do that in a year where you have a fresh, like 2016 might have been a better year for that. I mean, what's happened in the United States is the same as what has happened in Europe, except in Europe they have 5 parties, and here, or 4 or 5 parties, and here we have 2 parties, and it's just a question of, like, you know, you could make the argument that the right-wing parties of Europe just became the majority party of Republicans, and just the other Republicans went along with them, and you could make similar statements about the Social Democrats versus the moderates in the Democratic Party. I guess what I would say is I think I look at this even more differently, which is basically the United States has been living under the domestic architecture of the New Deal, both its employment law, I mean, both our tax law, all of our law is basically from the New Deal, and all of our international legal systems are from the immediate post-Cold War period, and the world has changed dramatically, and no one has a great answer as to how, particularly people who don't go to college, but even more and more, there'll be people who do go to college, have upward mobility in the world that we're in. And I think, like, essentially, I learned, I think it was strong and wrong beats weak and right, was a famous Bill Clinton expression. People are going to glom onto analysis if they don't have an answer. So both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump had an analysis of that. Yeah. Maybe not an answer, but an analysis.
But we had...
But I think we actually have to have better answers. And I mean to be Pollyannish, but I think someone who has a better answer as to what the country should do with people who are struggling with those changes will do better. And no one has answered that so far.
So we had enormously consistent, sustained growth from the end of World War II to the end of the last century, which enabled the political class to have essentially a consensus that the system is working. We can have our disagreements about Cold War, about whatever, but basically the economic bargain was working, and that could no longer wouldn't be violated. That's no longer the case with the kind of growth that we've had in the last 16 or 17 years. But back to your question, if Bernie Sanders had been the Democratic nominee, and Donald Trump was a Republican nominee,
yeah,
I think you could
Bloomberg
see
would have won.
Bloomberg getting in,
Yep.
and I think you'd have a very good chance of winning.
On that interesting note, thank you, Doug and Ira. Very interesting conversation. Well, it's a great pleasure to moderate this third panel, which will take even less moderating than the first 2, since I think people have something more in the nature of prepared remarks. This is an extremely distinguished panel of political science. We've had the practitioners, now we have the political scientists. But I would say these 3 political scientists are much more interested in practice than your typical political scientists, and so that's will be, I think it will not be as big a gulf as it might sometimes be. 3 people who need no introduction. This is the most distinguished group of political scientists assembled in Washington since Woodrow Wilson ate alone, I suppose. I'm going to even go on a limb and say more distinguished than Woodrow Wilson. Harvey Mansfield, professor of government at Harvard, and also some title here at Hoover, which I should probably remember since this is a Hoover event. But what are you at Hoover?
Senior fellow.
Senior fellow at Hoover. Mo Fiorina, who took a step down, leaving Harvard to go to Stanford and Hoover full-time, but very distinguished political scientist at Stanford and Hoover, and Jim Caesar at the University of Virginia. It really is, honestly, I'd say the single best political science panel I've ever watched, and so I'm going to watch it and not moderate it, and I'm looking forward to it. And I think we'll go in order of Harvey Mansfield, then Mo Fiorina, and then Jim Caesar, and then some time for comments and discussion and questions. So, Harvey Mansfield.
I begin with an anecdote. I'm an anecdotal political scientist, unlike Mo Fiorina, who's a careful and studied political scientist. And so I begin with an anecdote about a late colleague and friend of mine, Richard Neustadt, who told a story about himself having voted one day, and he came out of the voting booth, and he was accosted by an exit pollster, asked him how he voted, and he told him. And then the person said, well, why did you vote for this in this way? And he said, his answer was, because I'm a Democrat. And this puzzled the pollster. It was a she. She had a clipboard and it didn't have a category for people who voted because of their party. And I want to talk about that. And so that, if you understood everything that was in that anecdote, you don't have to listen to the rest of it. I'll try to explain what's in there. I want to talk about cause. Why do people vote? Why did he vote Democrat? And his answer seems to be tautological. How do you know that he's a Democrat? Because he votes Democratic. And that's why he votes Democratic. Cause seems to require cause and effect, in which the cause precedes the effect. Okay. Something outside the effect, external to the effect, causes the effect. But if you say, I'm a Democrat, and that's why I vote for, as a Democrat, the cause accompanies the effect. The first sense of cause and effect, is cause in the sense of modern science. The universe is made up of causes and effects, which are connected by necessary relations. A cause necessarily leads to its necessary effect. And this goes with the quantitative models of political science, which try to follow the premise of modern science as much as it can, and to reduce political science to a science of cause and effect. And so you look for causes of voting which aren't in the voting itself, but which are outside and which make you think that you ought to vote in this way. Say you make a certain amount of money, or you're a Jewish professor like Richard Neustadt, and this gives you certain characteristics which cause you to vote in a certain way. And this is often presented in a political science which is like economics. In a famous book written by Anthony Downs, An Economic Theory of Democracy, a book that is used by everybody and believed by nobody. And that's because he reduces a political man to economic man, as if you're a kind of automaton going to the polls, pushed inexorably by forces you can't control, but which control you and make you vote in a certain way which we as scientists can look at from the outside and explain and understand, and perhaps control ourselves. But what is an opinion? Could an opinion, like, I have an opinion which, because I'm a Democrat and I vote in this way. And certainly public opinion and party seem to be connected. How can opinion be understood scientifically? Well, opinion seems to be something subjective. So the scientists or the political scientists or the economic scientists have conceived the concept first in the 18th century of interest. That everybody has an interest, a self-interest, and this is objective as opposed to subjective, and fixed is a principle. That seems to be an opinion as opposed to an interest. When you act on interest, you act for something which will acquire you more, some kind of gain for yourself. Whereas when you act on a principle, that's something that's more general. You don't have only yourself in view, but you may even act against your interest. Can a principle be a kind of cause? As I said, interest was invented as something which is distinct from opinion, which is often zealous, irrational, fiery, and divisive. It's against your interest to hold polarized opinions. Now we're getting a little closer to a party situation today of polarization. Interest is in the nature of a human being. In your human nature, you have a desire for self-preservation, which gives you an interest in acquiring the things necessary for your self-preservation, especially economic things, especially acquiring property. But your principle is directed towards something else, something higher, normally thought to be higher, or more broad, or more general. Perhaps even if it's directed toward yourself, it could even be directed towards saving your soul, your salvation. But interest is something which is simplified, or simplification. It's exact, and it's clear. It's connected, therefore, to what can be counted, a quantity. Adam Smith had a famous sentence, which I don't remember exactly, that you owe your dinner, your sustenance, say, not to the public spiritedness of a merchant, of a butcher and a baker and a professor, but to their self-interest. They have an interest in doing what is good for you, and this is something that you can look at and count. So if you're a professor, you can be judged by the number of citations of your work that can be counted. A bad citation counts the same as a good citation. and that makes sense scientifically because numbers you can count, but to distinguish what is good from what is bad requires an act of judgment. And people differ in their judgment. So it's better to just leave it as something which is quantifiable. Is this kind of simplification possible? So interest as a fixed question, as a fixed notion, is now questioned, and this is done especially in the movement called postmodernism. Already in B.O.P., another late colleague of mine, though not so recent, was actually in one of his classes in the 1950s, as an undergraduate. B.O.P. said, and he was a great student of political parties, that an interest is a latent opinion. So it's not the cause of an opinion. It's not that you have an opinion because you have this interest, but the opinionated character or an opinion is already latent, it's already present in your interest. That begins to break down the distinction between interest and opinion, because your interest is already an opinion. Maybe your interest is as questionable or as arguable or as contestable as your opinion. Therefore, you might be able to use both interest and principle. And this is in a book by John Aldrich, which is, I think, the most commonly used text in political parties in America now. The title of which is Why Parties? According to Aldrich, he's a follower. Well, he's a follower in part of studying parties through interest, and in part of the so-called rational choice point of view. The rational choice point of view says, what is the choice of a rational individual? That's not quite the same thing as his interest, because the choice is something which is positive, but it's a rational choice which is similar to or close to one's interest. So opinions then become the rational choices of atomized individuals. And it's what you can bring in your opinion, but it's only what a rational person would have in this situation, causing you to vote in a certain way. So for the rational choice point of view, collective action is a problem as such. That's because everybody must be understood as an individual, and that means his choices must be understood as those that he would make individually. So you begin from everybody as individuals, and that means collective action, just acting together, becomes a problem, because is it in your interest as an individual to contribute to a collective action, such as to make a party or to gather in a party, Or is it in your interest to be a free rider and let somebody else do the work and you just take the benefit? If everybody were in doubt as to whether it was to his interest or rational for him to join some collective enterprise, then that enterprise would be in grave trouble. So how can collective action be thought to be possible to rational people? And so another more recent professor came along, James Campbell, who spoke differently on this. He said that the problem is not collective action as such, but what kind of collective action? What kind of collective action? So party then, or party government, is not the spontaneous effect of an interest or a rational choice. It's a way of acting that replaces some other way of acting, and both those actions are together. So man is a social or political animal, and collective action isn't the problem. We act collectively by nature. It isn't something that you have to learn or have to think your way to, but rather the problem is, should you act in a certain way with a certain form of organization or not? And parties started off, political parties started off as in free societies as a dubious way of acting because it's divisive. A party means you're dividing up the country and you've got some opponents and you've got some friends. And those friends and opponents are, in principle, they're what was called in the 18th century in English politics a formed opposition to the king. It was a free country, and as an individual you could stand up, if you were in parliament, say, and oppose what the king's government wanted to do. But if you formed an opposition by getting together with other people and kept this party in existence, say, for over a period of time, so that in principle it opposed another party in principle, you were dividing the country up. And as a divider, you were acting in a way that should be called conspiratorial. So political parties were first understood as conspiratorial or conspiracies in such a way that they were looked down on. It was not respectable to belong to a political party, even in a free country. And this changed in England with the political theory of Edmund Burke, who was the first one in 1770 to say that it was respectable for organizations of people in party organizations to gather and to act openly and publicly as a party. And that was because a party could stand for a principle as opposed to one's interest. These were parties not in the general public but in Parliament. So the king would he would select a prime minister, and then that prime minister, together with the king, would choose individual members of Parliament for the cabinet. And those individual members would then get a post in the cabinet. And Burke was with a group of people called, around his patron, his Lord Rockingham. Burke said, we must all stand together and insist that the king take us as a group instead of picking individuals for their particular thing. And that's because the king, in picking individuals, is appealing to the interest of those particular individuals in getting office. Whereas we, standing together, can stand for a principle that's higher and more responsible than just gaining office, each of us individually. So this meant that there was then a difference between principle and interest. And still today, you see that the idea of a principle is very powerful in our politics, to be principled. That Burke says some particular principle is the basis on which a party is. So when it's some particular principle, it doesn't have to be a true principle. It can be an opposing principle to some other principle. So we today understand good behavior in politics as principled. And if you hold to your principle, that's all right. And I may not agree with it, but at least I respect you. And if you don't, then you're being inconsistent and hypocritical, which is often even perhaps the main accusation of misbehavior in politics today, being hypocritical. And for some reason, it's a good thing to be principled, but it's a bad thing to be ideological. But what's the difference between being principled and being ideological? Now, what I think today exists is that a certain disquiet has arisen of party principle, about the effects of party principle. And this is in the polarization of our parties, which we see. Polarization has enshrined or improved the position of those principled voters who insist on making a distinction between themselves and the other party. If you look at parties from the standpoint of interest, the main principle is the main focus is on the median voter, because parties are thought to want to win, and in order to win, they have to win over people who don't agree with them. So when you do that, you have to go to the other side and win over people from the other side, and this forces a general movement on the part of both parties towards the middle, or towards the median voter, as it's called. The median voter becomes the person that you're trying to get, the marginal voter. But if under polarized conditions the two parties refuse to do this, they can find that they can win by working on the turnout of their side, of their partisans, instead of going for compromise for the median voter. So the question of the median voter has become controversial, I think, among political science today. And Mo Fiorina has also considered this whole question of the polarized voting. I mean, he makes a distinction between sorting and polarization, which I'll allow him to explain, because it's a very nice, in the sense of exact but also subtle distinction. But political scientists have, in general, taken the view that the median voter, or the middle voter, or the moderate voter, or the independent voter between the two parties is not a person to be commended or appreciated. Those people want to have it both ways. They want to say, have high benefits from the government but low taxes. And so they pick and choose from each party. They take the sweets and try to make a dinner which is made of dessert for themselves. Or they're just uninterested, apathetic, they don't think things through, so they stop. Also, they don't like argument. They get antsy and sort of disquieted when they see people arguing. But I think there also could be another reason, and that is that something of the anti-party spirit is still alive. The anti-party spirit, that original thought that a party is something like a conspiracy or a faction. The American founders, it seems, opposed parties because they had the character, or at least the appearance, or at least the spirit of faction attached to them. So Madison, in his famous number 10 Federalist paper, speaks of the spirit of party and faction. It isn't that party and faction are the same thing, but that they have a similar spirit. And I think a lot of people still think that way. Can't we get together? And isn't there something dubious or unattractive about the notion of partisanship and even of principle, if by principle you mean something which divides us, makes us unharmonious. I think I'm imposing on my fellow conspirators here, and I'll, well, let's see. Let me also speak against the term preference, which comes out of the economic understanding of voting. Already VOP was speaking of voting preferences in his work on voting. Preference is an economic term, but if you just think of what the word preference means, you think of vanilla and chocolate. If you're a lover of vanilla, that doesn't mean that you dislike chocolate. It just means you prefer vanilla. And especially it doesn't mean that you want to do away with chocolate and make it impossible for people to eat it anymore. But when it comes to political opinion, things are quite different. For example, on abortion. If you're in favor of abortion, you can say to people who are against it, all right, don't have an abortion. You can be against it. I'm not requiring you to have it. But that isn't sufficient for the person who is against abortion. That person doesn't want to live in a society where abortion is practiced, where it is respectable, and where, say, the life of a fetus is dependent on the convenience of its mother. So these are contrary opinions. Political parties oppose each other, and they oppose each other through arguments. That it isn't just that they conflict, but they conflict by means of argument. We just had partisans of our two parties in two panels, and they didn't make the arguments themselves because they weren't appealing for votes, but they presented the different but which are opposed arguments for the two parties. And so, and one of them said that Democrats would be in favor of this because the Republicans were opposed. So the two parties are in a kind of wrestling match, or a fight in which they argue with each other. I think that's the nature of political discourse. That it isn't just that there are two different opinions, so to speak, side by side, but that they're always listening to each other and answering each other. So, so that politics is something like an argument, and that's why political theorists who like to take up arguments, I think, have a way of understanding political parties which isn't or which has something to contribute. I also will remark that political science tries to be too neutral. Political science tries to have no agenda, because science, qua science, doesn't have an agenda. Political science does take surveys, but the data that they get from surveys consists of people's opinions. But science always looks for, as I said, or started off by saying, science always looks for what is behind opinions. When Galileo made his discovery, he didn't say, start off with a survey asking everybody, do you think that the Earth stands still or does it move? No. He discovered that on his own by neglecting, deliberately suppressing the common human view, which is that we're standing still and the rest of the objects in the sky are moving. So if you look for your political science from surveys, then you're basing it on opinions, which are always, being human, biased. Human beings always have an agenda. Science, so here's a science which claims to have no agenda, trying to study people who always have an agenda. Well, that means, I think, that a political science which looks to make judgments, and which tries to consider what is a rational choice, not in the sense of what is a possible choice for somebody who just wants to get the best for himself, but who wants what is a possible choice for a society, would have to be would have to engage in what are called value judgments. There is one political scientist studying parties, James Campbell, whom I mentioned before, who just remarks, by the way, in his study of parties, that there are leaders and there are misleaders. We have a political science, for the most part, except for him, that is content to use the word leader to describe Donald Trump, Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan, and Joseph Stalin. How can those all be leaders? Right? They believed in and did very different things, opposed things. Some of them must have been, maybe all of them were, misleaders. Leader is not a neutral term. When you say a leader, you mean leading to something good. If it's not to something good, then that isn't leading, that's misleading. So the study of political parties should, I think, culminate in a study, a kind of party history, which looks at our two parties and tries to decide over a period of time whether its leaders and its voters, because the voters are responsible for the leaders, this being a democracy, did the right thing. And there's a book by this, again, aforementioned D.O.P., his last book called The Responsible Electorate, in which he does this, in effect. He tries to look at how Americans voted from 1938 to 1960. He was trying to reconcile his fellow Democrats to the election of Eisenhower, a Republican. How could the voters have done this? So he explains it. But he gives here an example of a political scientist who looks at the two parties, tries to see what they contributed to, and to make a judgment on what they did. So that's what I think a political science of party should do. Thank you.
I found Harvey's panel refreshing, among other things, for the idealistic view of politics he presents. I think most of us who study parties live in a different world. I'm going to divide my time today into two parts. The first part I'll talk about the current party system. And then the second part, since I'm right here in the belly of the beast, I want to say a few things about the 2016 elections. A British political scientist about 25 years ago said that for him, the most important aspect of American exceptionalism was the fact that we have elections all the time. And even abstracting from primaries and state and local elections, we have the opportunity to change our national form of government every 2 years. Because unique among the world's advanced democracies, we have three important branches that are all elected independently. So you could have 8 different patterns of party control. So for example, George Bush, Republicans win everything. It's not, they don't show up in the screen, I just realized. Unified Republican government, they lose the Congress in 2006. The Democrats then get full control in 2008. They lose the House in 2010, and then Senate in 2014, and then we go back to unified Republican again. That's unusual. That electoral cleavages are pretty stable over time. So for example, this 20th century began with a long Republican era. They won full control for the first 14 years of the century. We had the Woodrow Wilson period briefly, and then they went back to winning full control again. That was followed by the New Deal, where the Democrats won 9 out of 10 full control of elections, ending with Eisenhower. Then we had a somewhat unusual era of divided government, where basically the Republicans won the presidency most of the time. Take away the 76 anomalous election, they might have won 6 in a row. Democrats always won the House and typically won the Senate as well. And all that came crashing down in 1992. And I won't go through all of this. Suffice it to say that as a professor, you had to throw out a lot of your old talking points in lectures. That the Democrats always win the House, well, no more. 1994 put an end to that. The President's Party always loses seats in the House of Representatives, not anymore. 1998 and 2002 put an end to that. Wave elections are a thing of the past. No, 2006, 2010, 2014, it's all different. And so when you put together the kind of table I had up here earlier, it's messy. You have Democrats and Republicans in all 3 cases. You have close elections. You have split between the electoral and popular votes in 2 cases. So it's an era of, the book coming out is called An Era of Tenuous Majorities. Nobody can hang on for very long. Why? The argument I make is that the Democrats and Republicans have become ideological parties like those that contested elections in Europe, in 20th century Europe. That's important because their parties are going the opposite direction from us now. They're actually getting less ideological. And the problem, as Harvey mentioned, I've differentiated over the last more than a decade between polarization. The United States has not become more polarized. Polarization is when the middle goes away and everybody goes to the polls. So ideological polarization, the moderates all disappear. That has not happened. Partisan polarization would be the independents disappear, everybody's a Democrat or Republican. That has not happened. What's happened is sorting. That basically the proportions of liberals, moderates, and conservatives, Democrats, independents, and Republicans haven't really changed in 30 years, but the parties are so much better sorted now. All the liberals are basically in the Democratic Party, all the conservatives in the Republican Party, so our parties are 2 ideological parties. The middle is still there, it just has no home in either party. Now you can call this partisan polarization if you want to, as long as you don't forget the fact that 40% of the country still declines to align with either one of the 2 parties. The problem with these two parties in the United States is very simple. There's only two of them. We have a very big heterogeneous democracy, and we have only two parties to represent them. Most of the advanced democracies are multi-party. Most of them have PR systems of one kind or another. France, according to the polls, is going to join us very briefly with a one-party government. But as you can see, typically all kinds of parties win seats in their parliaments. The coalition of parties typically runs the executive. There's compromise and coalition building that has to go on before you do anything. In the United States, as I say, we have two heterogeneous parties. Public opinion scholars tell us that there are three clusters of issues out there: foreign and defense, foreign, economic, and cultural. And just for purposes of argument, let's say you can take either a cautious or an assertive stance on foreign affairs. You can favor government, heavy government involvement or markets in economic issues. You can take a progressive or a traditional argument or stance in cultural issues. The Democrats say you can have number one, and probably Paul Krugman is very happy with that. And the Republicans say essentially you can have number 8, and Bill Kristol may be reasonably happy with that. If you're Rand Paul, well, you might prefer something in 3 or 4. If you're Joe Manchin, you might prefer something like 6. Now, those are rare birds at the Senate, but not in the population. In the population as a whole, there are people scattered all over these profiles. And what that means is most people in an election are going to have to vote for a party that's wrong on at least one of the things they care about. One of the implications of that is that the people who are happy with the party system are the strongest partisans, Republicans and Democrats. The weak Republicans and Democrats, the ones who won't move to Canada or somewhere else if their party loses, they're not as happy. The leaners, less still. The independents, less still. So as somebody was saying in the last session, there is in fact a big market out there for some sort of different kind of candidate, somebody with a different set of issues. I think part of Trump's appeal was nobody knew where he was. That basically, probably he's on the left the left side of these profiles in terms of his cautious stance on foreign affairs about not getting too involved. But he said we're going to cut taxes and have deregulation, but he also said we're going to protect Social Security and Medicare. He talked out of both sides of his mouth on issues like abortion. I don't think he ever said anything like gay rights. So basically, where was he? I think he could appeal to a broader swath precisely because of his ambiguity. Not the only reason, of course, but I think it's one of the contributing factors. Why do we have the unstable majorities? For the very simple reason that, and it's not the only reason, of course, these two parties tend to overreach. Each of their bases is not nearly big enough to win an election on itself. They take extreme positions. If you look at the two-party platforms on abortion, Democrats and Republicans, 80 to 85% of the population is in between those two platforms. They also focus on priorities of the base. Back in 2008, health care did not rank very high on the priorities of the American public, but it was important to the Democratic base. When you do this, you alienate the marginal supporters, the people who you need for majorities, and you have an electoral reaction, which typically occurs in the midterms. Now let me talk about the 2016 election. Here's some of the commentary written after it. Autocracy. More autocracy, civil war, tyranny, and doom, or fascism first, and doom. Reading all of this, I was reminded of a column the late David Broder wrote after the 2004 election. Many of you are too young for that, but Maureen Dowd wrote that Karl Rove had unleashed the forces of darkness in that election. Gary Wills wrote that the Enlightenment was now over. There was a lot of stuff like that, and Broder wrote a column and said, "Get a grip, people." And I was reminded of that. I think there's been too much made of this, a little too overwrought. There's more explanations of why Donald Trump won. Everybody understands this. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. Trump carried these 3 states by about 78,000 votes. That's 6/10,000ths of the national vote. If she had listened to Bill or to Joe Biden and gone into these states a little bit, changed half those votes, properly distributed, won the Electoral College and the popular vote as well, then the newspapers would have screamed that it had this headline the next day. You know. But very tiny changes in the popular vote in the kind of system we have can result in huge consequences, very consequential in terms of who controls and policies. But you have to remember the converse of that too. Just because there is an election that's very consequential doesn't mean the electorate or large segments of it intended those consequences. It's sort of, in a sense, a byproduct. The fundamental confusion here, I think, between the way we interpret politics and the way it actually is the confusion between the political class and what I call normal people. that the political class are the candidates, the interest group leaders, the activists, the donors, the people who write the snarky comments on the web pages and so forth. Normal people are the 80 to 85% of people who don't engage in those kinds of behaviors. Normal people are uninformed for the most part, uninvolved in politics, confused about what to do about health care, pro-choice and pro-life, and they tend to be pragmatic, not ideological. And just to bring some of this home, here are just some actual data as opposed to opinions. The nightly news still gets a lot of viewership. About 10% of the public, the eligible electorate up here, watches the news. That's down, of course, from about 60% in the 1960s. These are the three major networks, Fox and CNN. Our biggest circulation newspaper is USA Today with about 2% of the eligible electorate. The Journal and the New York Times get about 1%. Those are digital and print subscriptions. Before O'Reilly imploded, he was the highest rated show on cable TV with about 1.5% of the viewing audience. Fox News gets 1%. Rachel Maddow has doubled her audience since the election, and she's now up to 1%. PBS and Anderson Cooper, less than that. And in contrast, all of these things. 10 times as many people watch The Big Bang Theory every night as subscribe to the New York Times. Okay. They're uninvolved in politics. This is data in American National Election Studies from 1952 to the present. These are the people who attended a campaign meeting or rally. Excuse me. You can sort of look real hard and see Obama mania right there. All the Trump rallies in this last election, they don't seem to have done very much there. Despite the ease of giving on the internet, the proportion of people who give seems to have remained constant at about 10%. They give more often, but they don't give, there's not as many people. And if you know somebody who actually worked for a party or candidate, or if you did so yourself, they are really abnormal. They are down to around 2 or 3% here, as you can see. So this is normal. The people who are the public face of politics in this country, who appear on the shows, who sort of portray politics, and whom the media portrays politics as, are highly unusual in terms of the overall electorate. Explaining the Trump vote. Economic discontent, that seems to be clear. All the data show that Trump's voters weren't particularly poor themselves. They were actually better off on average. But there's a lot of economic pessimism about their future, their children's future, and it occurred especially in context where things were going bad, like the upper Midwest. Specific issues which seem to play a more important role in the primary campaigns than in the general election, where it became much more about personalities. And the three I want to talk about a little are the racism, xenophobia, misogyny, of course, and then anti-elitism, populism, and class. I think it's going to be hard to make an argument about racism, despite what the quotations say. And by the way, political scientists are going to write hundreds, if not thousands, of articles on these issues in the next 3 or 4 years, many of which will disagree because these are politicized, controversial areas. But Obama had approval ratings of about 55% at the time of the election. There were there were about a third of counties that had voted twice for Obama that did not vote, that voted for Trump in this election. Those counties were on average more than 80% white. There's a controversial measure we use in political science called racial resentment. A lot of people don't think it really measures that, but Trump's voters were actually slightly lower on that scale than Romney's voters in 2012. So all in all, I think it's going to be hard to argue that white voters who had voted for Obama and approved of his performance defected from a white Democratic candidate because they're racist. I mean, I'm sure we can make that argument, but it's going to be tortured. And the big thing is 1 in 3 white Obama voters defected, and I'll come back to that in about 2 minutes. The gender gap was a little bigger than usual, but not, not huge by any means, not out of the ordinary across all groups. The important thing was it's really important when the genders are on opposite sides of 50%, but they're not. Trump carried white women as well as white men. Okay. By the way, these are the data I have is from a big study was done for the Economist news magazine. It was a 16-wave study that started before Trump got in the election and continued after the election, and will be going out and contacting the same voters in the next few months. So sexism is going to be a hard argument to make. You don't want to say a majority of white women are sexists. You can say false consciousness, et cetera, but again, it's tough. The poll data we have say that Trump's treatment of women did bother people. It's just that they didn't think it was dispositive. They didn't think it was disqualifying. There were just other things that overwhelmed it. There's major controversies about Latinos. I think the most you can say at this point is that they didn't turn out in much larger numbers or vote for Democrats in much larger numbers than you would have expected given Trump's incendiary comments about Latinos. So here's a critical table. These are people who voted, how they voted in 2012, whites only, how they voted in 2016. Clinton lost a third of Obama's voters. Some going to Trump, others claiming they either didn't vote in the election or didn't vote at all. Trump held on to 3/4 of Romney's voters. There was a bit of a surge to Trump among the people who hadn't voted, but most of them didn't vote. If they didn't vote in 2012, they didn't vote in 2016 either. That the articles that have been written so far say that turnout is much less of a factor than vote switching in the last election, especially since this category is pretty small. What happened was that we had two really flawed candidates. And here's the data underlying that from Gallup. These are negative ratings, and prior to the last election, the most negatively rated Republican was Goldwater with 47. Trump obliterated that record with, by 17 points to 63. Not to be outdone, Hillary, the most negative Democrat, was McGovern with 41. She improved on that by 14 points to become the most negatively rated Democratic candidate in our modern history. This is from the Economist poll again. People ended up voting for Trump in spite of the negatives. Did they think he was qualified? No, only a third did. Did they think he was honest and trustworthy? Only a third did. But note, Hillary's even worse. Does he say what he believes? Well, people gave him a few points on that. He at least is authentic. But again, Clinton, terrible on that. Their voters held him in minimal high regard. Many disliked both. I cross-tabbed this. More than a third of the voters said, I'm going to be unhappy. I dislike both candidates, in this election. Exit polls showed the same thing. Is he qualified? No. Is he honest and trustworthy? No. Does he have the right temperament? No. Will he bring about needed change? It's sort of the big thing. It reminds me a little of 1980, where in the last week there was this big move to Reagan. People just seem to decide we can't take 4 more years of this. We got to try something different. So the fact is that a lot of voters went to the polls that day, a pox on both your houses, that people were saying, people were negative voting in a sense. This is a typical. Trump voters, a majority said they were voting against Clinton, not for Trump. This notion that millions of Americans woke up on election day and said, finally, I can indulge all my racist, sexist sentiments. I have a candidate who stands for them. That's false, I think. Most of them just went to the polls thinking, which one of these people am I gonna vote for? Okay. Yeah. I think the interesting thing that comes out of this is this whole notion of anti-elitism, populism, class. We haven't studied class in a long time. In the 1950s, everybody decided we were a classless society. And it's all been race, gender, and sexual orientation since then. And so we don't have a lot of measures on this, unfortunately. Everybody calls it populism. I think it's broader. I think it's sort of an anti-elitism that transcends what was thought of as populism traditionally. Populism has always had this resentment of economic actors, and it's there in this election, of course, Wall Street, and the political actors who protect them, and that's the party establishments are there. But this time, it's really extended a lot more in a cultural sense. The people who call them the deplorables, for example, and the media. The poll numbers on the media are just in the pits, that the media have become part of the targets, the opposition. And I think this extends beyond sort of this notion of the white working class, which has gotten so much attention in recent commentary. The media, like to say there was some critical group that decided the election. So 92 was the year of the woman. These are big groups, at least. 94 was the year of the angry white male. Then it starts to get silly. We got the soccer moms and security moms, and we got the NASCAR dads, and we got the Joe Six-Pack, and then we got waitress moms. And now it's the working class male. I just think it's broader, and here's the really interesting data, I think, from this Economist survey. Typically, they simply say college educated, not college educated. It gets more interesting if you break it down. Yeah, among those with a high school education or less, Trump just swept through, Among those with only some college, community college or something like a year or two, again, and again among women as well. Among people with only a 4-year degree, Trump easily carried men and appears to have possibly carried women as well. So in other words, these are just four-year degrees. And it's only when you get to the post-grad level that women overwhelmingly went for Clinton. And basically Trump may have carried men in that category as well. So although the strength of Trump was clearly strongest in the very lower level, it extends pretty much up into the middle class, the whole middle class. It's everybody who's a college graduate didn't go to a liberal arts school and study the humanities. There's just a whole lot of people who went to state universities, did agriculture, engineering, and other things like that. So, sum up, the election's been overinterpreted. Civil war is not close. Americans had a lousy choice set. These sort of pathologies were probably exaggerated, and the Democrats' problem goes into the middle class as well as the working class. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Allow me to begin by reintroducing Edward Banfield, who may be unknown to many in this room. But Banfield was a famous, perhaps even the most famous political scientist in America just after the middle of the last century. He spent much of his career teaching at Harvard University and authored a very famous book entitled The Unheavenly City that focused on American urban affairs and social policy. And I'll add in passing that the book earned him, in a way, redolent of Charles Murray, the dubious honor of being shouted down and prevented from speaking at many university campuses. These instances mark the beginning of sanctioning of free speech in the name of something higher. And this was a way that university administrators at the time were able to move up in the ranks by siding with the students in this suppression. At any rate, in 1961, Banfield wrote a famous essay entitled In Defense of the American Party System. The essay spans some 16 pages, and in reading it, I noticed, wonder of all wonders, that Banfield never mentions the Democrats or the Republicans. Indeed, he never mentions any specific party or party program in the whole essay. Just how is it conceivable or possible to discuss the American party system without ever taking note of any particular party, or without betraying in the slightest a predilection for one party and its point of view? How can one defend passionately the party system without defending or seeming to care about its main components, the parties, and their positions? How can you love the party system, an abstraction if there ever was one, while ignoring the parties? Now, a party, Harvey Mansfield tells us in a paper he distributed to us, is a part of the whole that wants to rule the whole. And he goes on and says, its contention is a claim to rule, a justification of its rule against that of its opponent or opponents. So a party wants to rule the society. And this would seem to be a fairly important claim, the claim of who rules. So how, in Banfield's case, can it be ignored? And today, of course, moving up to today, in the study of American party system, the individual parties are surely never ignored. For example, two of the nation's leading political scientists, Tom Mann and Norm Ornstein, wrote a widely read book entitled It's Even Worse Than It Looks, in which they discuss the current party system and deplore its inability to get things done. Mann and Ornstein, I'll call them Mornstein to save time, they take note of a failure of parties to sufficiently grease the wheels and engage in compromise, condemning in particular the Republicans for their inveterate opposition to bargaining and making deals. Mornstein even gives the proclivity to not make deals a fancy name, calling it asymmetrical polarization. All maybe are guilty of polarization, but woe betide the party that indulges in the sin of asymmetry. It may be today that the Democrats deserve to be driven by this label. I'm not sure. But in any case, all of the mighty instruments of political science today are taken up with trying to answer the question, which party is to blame for being more asymmetrical? And for once, I suppose Hillary Clinton's comment makes sense. What difference does it make? But the point here, going back to Banfield, is that it's inconceivable today to talk about our parties without talking about our particular parties. That's the case today. So how could Banfield have ignored mentioning any of the parties? Here's the answer, I think. It's interesting. Banfield was focused on the American electoral process first, meaning the means by which we secure the choice of our representatives, our senators, and our presidents. The things that were referred to as parties in 1961 played a central role inside of this electoral process. But the truth was that these entities, Democrats and Republicans at the time, were scarcely parties in the literal sense of wanting, in Harvey's terms, to be a part of the whole that wants to rule the whole. In fact, if one was to be accurate, especially at the congressional level, these parties at the time were hardly interested in ruling. They functioned to promote and satisfy local ideas and interests, and within each party differed greatly among themselves on matters of principle. So if you want to ascribe a purpose or function to these parties at the time, one could say that they were involved in suppressing and dampening the real divisions that might otherwise rise to the top. It would be correct to characterize the parties at this time, at least in Banfield's way of thinking, as more or less anti-parties, functioning to avoid and break up the possibility of ruling in any way akin to the true or real parties of today. The job the parties at the time performed was to get people to Washington, allow them to make trades, and occasionally to deliberate with each other without the full pressure operating on them coming from party orthodoxies. So we have this one word, party, which is used, but it has an entirely different meaning, and we get confused. This, Banfield thought, was a sensible way of doing business. The real issue was not the parties, but the electoral process. Our parties helped get people into office who were in a position to deal and occasionally deliberate with no or little influence from things we call real parties. Keep them out of politics. To repeat, what we had in the old days and what we called parties functioned largely as an anti-party system. The party stymied and diminished the manifestation of real parties. Banfield, as I said, was deeply appreciative of this old party system. He was only too happy to see the electoral process dominated by these half or non-parties. Of course, Banfield realized how fragile this arrangement could be. There were many people at the time who were anxious to promote something new, to institute real political parties, which they called at the time responsible political parties, and ensure that our electoral process was a contest among these real political parties. Let parties be parties was the position of the American Political Science Association at the time. It sought to get rid of our archaic parties and put in real parties. The person who wrote the report of the discipline of political science calling for these real parties was a person named E.E. Schatzschneider. Nice name. And he wrote this famous line: "The political parties created democracy and modern democracy." Excuse me. The political parties created democracy, and modern democracy is unthinkable save in terms of the parties. So parties are the core of our political system in his view. This claim was surely untrue, even as it was regarded as authoritative. Banfield, of course, thought that the introduction of true or real political parties would be a bad thing for the nation. The aim should be to limit modern democracy for the public good. The effort to build parties, Banfield predicted, would bring about ideologues who could not easily compromise, and in the race for the presidency, demagogues and mass marketing specialists who only pretended to be partisans, but who were often more interested and concerned with their own ambition for high office. For Banfield, it didn't really ultimately matter if you were a Democrat or a Republican, hence he could leave them out. What mattered is if you defended the old party system as such and opposed the new idea of parties. That old system has been wholly uprooted now by a host of changes, some intentionally legislated by rules changes and new rules inside of our legislatures. Others are a matter of unintentional developments in media and demography. Today, we defend a democratic system based on something new, and we're interested in having new and participatory parties, even though today there are some who are less and less happy with what it has produced. More recently in Washington, there's a reaction against what has occurred inside our party system. People led by Jonathan Rauch at Brookings, may I mention Brookings? Want to change our party system and go back to the older form. They cite Banfield or his student, James Q. Wilson. They call themselves realists, the new realists, even though their project of going back maybe makes them look a bit utopian. Parties are sorted today into ideological blocks. People are educated. They want a real party and will stand for nothing less. They are, in other words, for real modern parties. What can we actually expect to result in the future? As I suggested, a return to old parties along the lines that Banfield and Wilson wanted but feared would no longer exist in the future, that's quite unlikely. What we will see, and here's I think the possibilities, on the one hand, more and more continuing ideological parties in Congress, real parties you could say, responsible parties. Also though, in possible choice for our presidential candidates, they will operate the parties under an umbrella which allows anyone to enter and anyone inside the American political system to win the race on their own. So the result will be, in this case for presidency, potentially some ideologues, certainly charismatic figures along the lines of Barack Obama, demagogues of some sort or another entering, celebrities from outside of government, and individuals of all sorts. We will have Macron within our parties. Thank you.
Jim Caesar thinks you can't go back to, let's call it, the old party system. It seemed to me, Mo, you were suggesting that that was not quite as, given where the voters are the obstacles to that as prohibitive, or are we seeing a peak? Is it one of those moments where everyone thinks, you know, we're now doomed to this for the future, but this is the peak moment of the new party system, and we could go back or go forward to something more like the old system? And I guess I asked Harvey the same question.
I guess I wouldn't say it with high confidence, but I think I agree with Jim that the darkest night is always before the dawn.
Yeah.
You know, we may be at the nadir of things, and if a Macron type, you know, I'm not sure it would be Bloomberg, but somebody sketching out a set of positions, sort of moderate Trumpian positions in some respects and Democratic in other respects, I could see an attractive candidate running on that and scarfing up a big chunk in the middle. It's harder in our system just because we have this majoritarian system, and the primary process on top of it, or in advance of it really, makes it more difficult, but it's possible.
So it's always darkest before the dawn, that John McCain likes to say, except when it's always darkest before it turns pitch black. You know, so what is the actual truth of that? Is it actually darkest before the dawn? I'm a little dubious about that. Is the old system different from the new system, do you think? I mean, can one talk about party government in America without making the distinction that Jim wants to make so strongly?
Well, it's true today that we're all overeducated and stuffed with ideas, hence with passions that arise from ideas. So I believe in hatreds too, more. Hatreds arising from our disagreement with your view of justice. But, so maybe we'll be facing that in a darker future. But another thing is, the main, I think, feature of politics is today is the progressivism. The Democrats want more of it, and the Republicans much less of it. And so the viability of the progressive movement, which I think started in the early 20th century and now is just about 100 years old. I think that's open to question. And so I'm looking forward to a lot of confusion, and just because I think our ideologies or our main focus is going to go is going to cause us major trouble. I look at Greece, and I think it's not that Greece is a small country and a weak country, and it's not like us, and yet they illustrate the situation that we're headed toward, which is that people are willing to vote themselves expensive benefits, but not to tax themselves to pay for them. And so with the extent of our debt and our continuing deficit, and also with the clumsiness and irresponsibility of the bureaucracy needed to enforce or implement government programs, and the third difficulty, the foreign policy weakness that arises from a belief that government consists in giving benefits to everybody. So I think that they were sort of headed towards the twilight of the welfare state, and that our politics is going to be characterized by confusion in how to respond to this difficult situation that faces us.
As I'm sure most people in this room know, that our United States Constitution was not envisioned with the concept of parties. Would it be better off and more consistent with the framers' intent to go to multiple parties like Australia, Canada, and everything like that? And if so, how do we get there?
No, multiple parties are still parties. They still want to rule, but they're ridiculously small to do so. So we have a much more intelligent two-party system that allows, it requires us to get together before the election instead of after the election. And I think that that makes sense. I do not think that party government is going to go away, and that we can return to having a free country without respectable open parties. I think that change is permanent, but we should keep in mind the fact that there's always an anti-party argument. And it's not just anti-two-party, but anti-any-party argument, and that which arises from the kind of citizenship which a liberal democracy encourages, which is, how should I say, lacking in public spirit. But a live and let live citizenship that Fiorina regards as normal and would defend to the death, right? With passionate hatred for all its opponents. So I can stop teasing you. But yes, but we won't be going back to non-party government, but we may be headed into and are already perhaps in a condition where people are much more doubtful about the goodness of party as such.
Could I?
Yeah.
I used to think that it didn't really matter whether you had two or multi, that in a two-party system, the compromises took place at the electoral level. And in the multi-party system, they took place, as you say, at the government level. But I've changed my mind over time because of the shape of modern parties. First, they don't really take place at the electoral level anymore because the primary system is spread throughout the country. We have 8% turnouts in these elections, and it's the base. It's the fanatics, et cetera, who choose, so the compromises aren't being made. And the thing about at the electoral level is what they do is they think, this is my time, we got to strike while the iron is hot. They don't compromise it. Nancy Pelosi in 2009, I think, knew that this was going to kill her party. But the point was, this might be our only opportunity. Now, if she'd had to form a coalition with some other party, you might have said, we're not going along with that because it's going to kill our coalition. So I reserve the right to change my mind again based on evidence, but the course of events, the transformation of modern parties has sort of led me to rethink that.
Hi, I'd like to hear what you have to say about tendencies in other countries. So, for example, like countries across Europe that don't have such a robust two-party system, a similar rise in dissatisfaction in politics and nationalism in those countries as well.
I'll take a crack at that. I have a very sort of chapter on that. It's not very good, I don't think, but no, I just it's not my area of expertise. But all around the world, I think part of what's underlying this, people talked about economic growth earlier today, there are transformations going on that are big societal and economic transformations. Globalization, industrial, the kind of the manufacturing, old manufacturing order and the rise of this new informational order, service, et cetera, order, mass immigration, internal population movements in the United States. All of these things create real problems in society. There are winners and losers. They disrupt old coalitions that suddenly they find themselves in opposite factions on opposite sides of certain issues. They suggest opportunities for new political entrepreneurs, especially in Europe, new parties. And I basically think that the established elites, the political classes, not just in the U.S. but everywhere, have not done a very good job dealing with these things. And so there's this, the nice thing about one of the first diagrams I put up, the Republicans won for 14 consecutive years. Well, McKinley came into office, governed in a way that people thought pretty acceptable. The economy was booming, et cetera, so they kept returning them to office. Somebody has got to, if Macron doesn't deliver, that hope is going to go in France pretty quickly. They'll split up again. But somebody like that has got to win office and deliver on the problems that people really care about. Otherwise, I think we just keep percolating along.
But before McKinley, of course, there was 30 years
exactly.
of non-delivery and going back and forth. I mean, we do sort of write the history afterwards thinking it was all very smooth. Someone said to me the other day, well, this, yes, information technology, globalization, robots and all. It's one of those transitions, but we had to transition from agriculture to industrial and all that. And it's like, well, that was kind of a rocky 50 years.
Exactly.
And it's like people looking back think, well, that was, we made, and I mean, we may be entering, I suppose, what you're saying, maybe what everyone's saying, a rocky decade or two or three, as opposed to a maybe artificially sort of semi-stable situation that did exist for quite a while. We had 3 8-year presidencies. The only time that's happened before was right after the founding, right? And for all the volatility, really, of the last 25 years, impeachment and off-year elections, I would say from a historical point of view, this was a fairly unusually stable, sorted. The parties sorted. They gradually sorted more and more and more, but they were recognizable. If you left from the Democrats and Republicans of '94, recognizable as the Democrats and Republicans in Congress of 2014. That's not always been the case in American history, and I do wonder whether you could have 20 years now coming up. The analogy that occurs to me is 60 to 80. And think about what American politics looks like in 1960 when Ed Banfield wrote the piece that Jim mentions, and what it looks like in 1980 on a whole set of issues, including the nature of the parties, which sector of the country the parties are strong in, what the issues that are in play, what the changes that have happened. And then you sort of have after that, especially after the end of the Cold War, a fairly stable period where people are trying to work out the post-Cold War issues and so forth. And maybe we're going to go into a 60 to 80 type situation with more social upheaval and more partisan upheaval. But the fact of a party system does seem to stay through these different periods. I guess that is striking. Yeah. Macron wins as a non-party candidate, and the first thing he does is establish a political party, which promptly wins a huge majority. So somehow you need a party to govern, I guess, in a modern democracy. No one's really, no king, I don't know.
No, that's right. So the argument of Schaffsnyder has some strength to it. Yeah. But still, I think the fundamental question is, since we have a self-governing democracy, how well has America governed itself? What are the prospects? I think that's a question for a citizen, and also a question should be the main question for political science.
My question has to do with any possible connection between the last few decades the rise in antipathy between members of different parties for the other person of the other party just because they're of the other party, along with the decrease or the dropout of voter participation. You mentioned earlier about I think someone mentioned earlier about the base is the one that's decided. The primaries, which is more ideological extremes, does that have any effect in it, or whatever is the connection between these two trends? What might they teach us about ameliorating these ills?
Okay, first of all, turnout has actually increased on the whole since 1996, so it's been this curvilinear thing. The question refers to negative partisanship, that the data show pretty clearly that people don't like their own party any better now than they did 20 years ago, but they dislike the other party more. And they call this affective partisanship. But the point is they seem to differentiate it from cognitive ideas, that there may be reasons, and the reason I think is party sorting, which I talked about, that if you're a father in 1960, that is some of the data they have, and your child comes home and says, I'm going to marry, you're a Democrat, and says, I'm going to marry a Republican, you think, well, what kind of Republican? Sort of a Nelson Rockefeller liberal from the Northeast, or some Midwestern car salesperson, or some sagebrush guy like Barry Goldwater. It doesn't tell you a whole lot. So it's going to marry a Democrat. Well, a Southern conservative, a union guy from Detroit, or a Western guy who wants to build dams, you know, just sort of, it doesn't tell you a lot. Fast forward to today that the parties are assorted. Your son comes home and says, I'm going to marry a Republican, and you think you're going to bring an evolution-denying homophobe into the family, or it says you're going to marry a Democrat, and you think an America-hating atheist you're going to bring in. That because the parties have sorted so much, and because the media have these stereotypical ways of portraying what the parties look like, it conveys, the party label conveys a whole lot of more information, poor information, I think, but a whole lot more information than it used to.
They say in Congress that people are always going home, you know, to campaign all the time, so they don't have a chance to fraternize as much as they used to either.
Yeah.
So they can't become buddies. But since I've spent no time on the Hill, I can't confirm that fact.
Final thought?
Yes, I'm not against public spirit. I think that's more good than harm, and it can be very harmful if people develop a kind of perverse public spirit against public spiritedness.
Well, I'm in favor of public spirit. Honest public spirit, but not what we have today is personal ideology masquerading as public spirit. That's, I think, would you accept that as a friendly amendment?
Yes, especially if it's directed toward Mr. Trump. but a certain personal personal expression, I think, is part of one's public spirit. You have to like yourself doing good, and not always restrain that that impulse. But the danger I was speaking about was that you will be so against the feeling of public spiritedness that your private resentment takes hold of you and produces a kind of violence in thought and sometimes action. So yes, there is such a thing as too much public spirit, but there can also be too much dislike of public spirit.
On that note, thank you all for coming. Thank you for your